Smoke rolled over the patio just as I realized Miles was no longer beside me. I ran for the back door, but a firefighter caught my arm and shoved me toward the lawn, while another crew disappeared inside. Minutes later, they brought my 12-year-old son out burned, barely conscious, and headed for the helicopter. Behind me, my mother was already talking about insurance. My father asked about his golf clubs. Then a fire marshal lifted a half-melted Zippo from an evidence bag, and Dad's face changed before anyone said his name. If you're here with me, I hope you're doing well. Stay with me to the end, and if stories like this matter to you, please subscribe. 3 hours earlier, the most dangerous thing in my parents' house had seemed to be my father's ability to turn any piece of furniture into a 40-minute history lesson. Miles had been standing beside an antique long-case clock in the gallery, squinting at a tiny brass plate near the base while Dad explained something about the maker, the wood, and an English family who had supposedly owned it before it crossed the Atlantic. My son listened with the solemn patience 12-year-olds reserve for adults they love enough not to interrupt, at least for the first 2 minutes. Then he glanced at me over his shoulder. "Grandpa, I think my history teacher covered 2 wars faster than you explained that screw." Dad stopped with one finger still raised toward the clock. For half a second, he looked genuinely wounded. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Miles grinned. That was the relationship they had. My father could be exhausting, proud, particular, and spectacularly incapable of telling a short story. But with Miles, he had always softened around the edges. He had taught him how to hold an old photograph by the edges, how to spot veneer lifting from a tabletop, how to listen for the difference between a cheap clock movement and a hand-fitted one. Miles did not care what anything was worth. He cared who had owned it, where it had traveled, whether someone had hidden a note behind a drawer or carved initials where no one was supposed to see them. Dad loved that about him. At least I had always believed he did. The house sat on several acres west of Richmond, far enough into Goochland County that traffic thinned before the road narrowed between trees. My parents had bought it when Eric and I were teenagers, and spent years turning it into the kind of place people described as gracious instead of large. The oldest section had narrow hallways, original woodwork, and floors that complained under your feet. Newer additions had made the place comfortable, without quite making it simple. There were too many rooms, too many doors, and too many objects with histories Dad considered worth preserving. Mom considered the whole place proof that they had built a good life. That Saturday lunch had not been my idea. I had tried twice to move it. Scott had been buried in a systems rollout all week, and Miles had complained that school had only just started, and Saturday was supposed to be the day he remembered what sleeping past 7 felt like. I had suggested the following weekend. Mom had rejected that before I finished the text. Then she called. She said she had already moved something else around. Dad had been looking forward to seeing Miles, and we never managed to get everyone together anymore. She especially wanted Scott there. When I told her he might have to stay near his laptop, she pushed again, gently enough that it did not sound like pressure, unless you had spent 42 years being pressured by Diane Bellamy. In the end, I did what I usually did. I made the easier choice. We went. Nothing about the afternoon felt important enough to remember at first. Mom served lunch outside because September was still warm. Scott checked his phone twice, apologized without saying the word, and finally put it face down on the table. Miles stole roasted potatoes from my plate after finishing his own. Dad complained that the landscaping crew had cut one hedge too low. Mom pretended not to hear him. I remember those small things now, because later I would be asked to separate memory from assumption, fact from habit, what I had actually seen from what I believed must have happened, because it usually did. At the time, none of it mattered. Mom brought out her phone after dessert and said she wanted a family picture before we left. That was not unusual. She documented gatherings more than the rest of us did. Scott had already started gathering glasses when Eric texted that work had kept him across town and he would not make it. Mom frowned at that longer than the disappointment seemed to warrant. then told the rest of us not to disappear before she got her picture. Dad disappeared not long afterward. I barely noticed. That is one of the truths I have had to learn to live with. Important moments do not announce themselves as important while you are inside them. One minute he was outside talking to Scott about golf. The next, his chair was empty. I assumed he had gone inside to check something. Dad had been carrying his phone around all day, glancing at it more than usual, but that was hardly remarkable. He still treated retirement like a temporary clerical mistake, and behaved as if some former client might need him to fix the commercial property market before dinner. Mom asked me to help gather serving dishes. I carried a platter inside through the kitchen doors, rinsed sauce from it, and came back out. I do not remember seeing Dad inside. That would matter later. At the time, I did not even ask where he was. Scott was describing a problem at work without using the vocabulary he knew would make my eyes glaze over. Miles was lying on the low stone wall with one arm over his face, announcing that adulthood sounded terrible. Mom folded napkins, as if they were going into a drawer, instead of a laundry basket. The afternoon moved forward without resistance. Then Dad came back. He stepped onto the patio from the house, put his phone face down beside his glass, and lowered himself into his chair. There was no soot on him, no smell that I noticed, no trembling hands. Nothing in his face made me think he had just done anything more significant than take a phone call. Scott resumed whatever he had been saying. Dad disagreed with him about golf handicaps, and Miles groaned loudly enough to make us all look at him. A few minutes after Dad came back, Mom waved Scott away from the glasses and pulled all four of us toward the stone wall. Dad complained about the sun. Miles complained about Dad complaining. She took 3 pictures. In one, Miles leaned into Richard's shoulder. The metadata later fixed that photograph at 2:41. At the time, it was only a family picture, and everything about the afternoon still felt ordinary. By a little after 3, Scott wanted to leave, before traffic toward Richmond thickened. I had gathered my bag and was checking that I had not forgotten the container Mom had packed for us when Miles patted the pockets of his hoodie, stopped, and looked toward the house. He had left his headphones upstairs. They were large, black, noise-canceling ones Scott had given him for his birthday, and Miles treated them with the devotion other children reserved for pets. He remembered leaving them on the bed in the upstairs guest room where he had gone after lunch to escape one of Dad's phone conversations. I told him to get them quickly. It was an ordinary instruction, the kind that only became sharp afterward because I was his mother and he had obeyed me. Miles pushed through the back doors and disappeared into the house. I turned back to Mom. She was holding out a plastic container she wanted me to take. Scott was trying to remember where he had put the car keys. Dad had begun examining something on his phone. Nobody watched Miles go upstairs. Nobody followed him. I do not know exactly how many minutes passed. 4, maybe 5, not 10. I was standing beside Scott near the edge of the patio when I smelled something that did not belong there. At first it was faint enough that my brain tried to explain it away. Someone burning leaves. A neighbor's fire pit. Something from the kitchen. Then the smell thickened, sharp and bitter, and Scott turned at almost the same moment I did. A gray ribbon had appeared beyond the roofline over the gallery side of the house. Dad stood so quickly his chair scraped backward against the stone. Mom dropped the lid of the container she was holding. For a second, none of us moved. Then Dad shouted that something was burning. What happened after that has never returned to me as a clean sequence. It exists in fragments. Scott grabbing his phone, Mom moving toward the doors and then stopping, Dad circling toward the side of the house, the smoke changing color, my own hands suddenly empty. I remember calling for Miles. I remember expecting him to answer from somewhere behind me. Nothing. I looked toward the lawn, toward the driveway, toward the patio. My eyes counted 3 adults when they should have counted 4. The container slipped from my hand. Miles. I said his name once, then louder. Scott went completely still. He knew before I finished saying it. The headphones. The guest room. Our son was still inside. I ran. The kitchen doors were already coughing dark smoke along the top edges when I reached them. Heat pressed through the opening with such force that I flinched backward before instinct drove me forward again. I got 1 foot across the threshold. Scott caught my shoulder from behind. I fought him. There is no noble way to describe that. I did not think about fire behavior, smoke inhalation, structural collapse, or whether I would become another person firefighters had to rescue. I thought about my child upstairs because I had told him to go back in. I remember trying to wrench free. Then someone else was there. A neighbor had called 911 almost immediately after seeing smoke over the roof, and the first engine arrived faster than my memory allows. Later I would know the times. That afternoon there were only sirens and boots and hands moving me away from the doorway. A firefighter asked where Miles was. I pointed toward the second floor and told him the guest room was above the central hall, toward the west side. I kept talking long after he had turned away, describing the stairs, the hallway, the room, anything that might make 30 feet of house easier to cross. Smoke rolled over the patio. The realization was not a thought so much as my body trying to go somewhere it could not go. A firefighter blocked me again, as another crew disappeared inside. Scott wrapped both arms around me from behind. I could feel his chest shaking against my back. Dad stood several yards away with one hand pressed against the side of his head. Mom had backed onto the lawn. She was staring at the windows, as if she could force one of them to produce her grandson. For the first time that afternoon, the house looked as large as it actually was. Every upstairs window became a possibility. Then glass broke. Someone shouted from the side yard. A firefighter pointed toward the second floor. I saw movement at a window. Not a face at first, just a shape behind smoke-darkened glass. Then a hand. Small, low against the pane. My knees nearly folded. Miles had made it back to the guest room. Later, firefighters would explain that he had tried to come downstairs, encountered heat and heavy smoke near the central hall, and retreated. He had burns on exposed skin and deeper injuries where heat had reached him during that attempt. He had managed to close the bedroom door behind him, and that single ordinary action had bought him time. I did not know any of that while I watched. I only knew my son was behind that window, and I could not reach him. A ladder went up. The next few minutes stretched beyond normal time. One firefighter reached the window. Another entered from inside. Smoke poured past them. Then Miles appeared. He was not walking. The sight of him being brought down changed the shape of the world. His skin looked wrong in places my mind refused to process. His hair was singed near one side. His face was streaked black and gray, except where tears or water had cut through soot. He made a sound when they transferred him to the stretcher, small enough that I almost wished he would scream, because screaming would have sounded stronger. I tried to touch him. A paramedic moved my hand away from one of the burned areas and guided me toward the side of the stretcher where I could hold his fingers instead. His hand closed around mine once. Not tightly. Enough. The paramedics worked around him with the speed of people who knew exactly how much time mattered. Oxygen, dressings, monitoring, rapid questions about his age, health, allergies, and weight. I heard full-thickness burns and concern about inhalation exposure. The local hospital was not where they wanted him, so they arranged air transport to specialized pediatric burn care in Richmond. The helicopter arrived in a storm of noise and flattened grass. That was when Mom spoke. She had been quiet for several minutes, watching firefighters move hoses through what had been her home. Smoke drifted from the broken windows. Water ran black across the stone. Mom stared at the gallery wing. Hope insurance covers my vintage furniture. I turned my head slowly. There are sentences so misplaced that the mind rejects them before meaning arrives. Behind us, my 12-year-old was being prepared for a helicopter because parts of his skin had been burned through. My mother was looking at furniture. I could not make my mouth work. Maybe she saw my face. Maybe she did not. She hugged her arms around herself and kept staring at the house. Dad was no better. He had moved close enough to one of the firefighters leaving the side yard to ask about damage. I could not hear everything, but I heard enough. He wanted to know whether the antique golf club stored near his study had survived. The firefighter gave him a look I would remember long after I forgot the man's face. No answer. Just a fraction of hesitation, as though he was making sure he had heard correctly. Scott heard it too. My husband's jaw tightened. He did not confront Dad. He did not need to. He turned away from him and walked back toward our son. That small movement changed something between them, before any of us understood how much more there was to change. The flight crew allowed one parent to accompany Miles. Scott did not argue about who it would be. He squeezed the back of my neck once and told me he would drive to Richmond as soon as he could. His voice sounded level, but he kept pressing his thumb against the edge of his wedding ring until the skin underneath went white. I climbed toward the helicopter. Before the door closed, someone called my name. Not Mom, not Dad. A woman in a dark fire investigation jacket was coming across the lawn. I had noticed her earlier speaking with the incident commander and photographing the exterior after the main body of fire had been knocked down. She introduced herself as Leah Benton, the county fire marshal handling the origin and cause work. She was careful with her words. The scene was still active. Nothing had been concluded. Investigators had only begun examining the gallery side once firefighters made enough of it safe to enter. Then she lifted a clear evidence bag. Inside lay a metal lighter, blistered and darkened by heat. Part of its casing had warped. One edge looked as if it had tried to melt into itself, but the initials were still visible. R.B. Richard Bellamy. Dad had owned engraved Zippos for as long as I could remember. He liked objects that lasted, objects that could be repaired, objects with weight and history. Leah did not tell me it had started the fire. She did not tell me anyone had committed a crime. She said it had been recovered in an area they were currently treating as potentially significant to where the fire began, and that she needed Dad to remain available while they documented the scene and took statements. "Don't leave," she told him. That was all. My father looked at the lighter, and the color drained from his face. He did not reach for it, or immediately ask how it had gotten there. He simply stared. I had seen him angry, embarrassed, sick, and frightened before. This was different, though I did not yet know what the difference meant. A face was not a confession, and fear was not proof. All I had was a damaged lighter, a house still smoking behind us, and a father who suddenly looked as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The helicopter crew called me again. I turned away. Whatever had happened in that house, Miles came first. I climbed inside and sat where they told me. My son was strapped beneath layers of medical equipment, his face partly obscured, his small fingers motionless beside the blanket. Through the open door, I could still see Scott on the grass. Beyond him stood Mom, then Dad, then Leah Benton holding the evidence bag. The door began to close. I put my hand where Miles might feel it without touching injured skin, and watched my parents disappear behind metal. I should have been able to think about only one thing: whether my son would survive. Instead, as the helicopter lifted, and my parents' house shrank beneath us, another question lodged beside that terror, and refused to leave. What was my father's Zippo doing in the part of the house? Investigators had already begun to watch most closely. The helicopter was so loud that there was no room inside it for panic to sound, the way panic usually sounded. There was only vibration beneath my shoes, the tight pressure of the headset against my ears, the medic's gloved hands moving over Miles, and the changing numbers on a monitor I did not understand well enough to trust. I sat where they had placed me with one hand resting against the edge of the stretcher, close enough that I could feel the faint movement whenever the aircraft shifted, but careful not to touch any of the dressings covering my son. Every few seconds, my eyes found his face. That was how I measured time. Not by minutes, by whether his chest still rose, by whether the medic looked alarmed, by whether anyone reached suddenly for something. The flight to Richmond was short compared with what came after. When the doors opened, another team was waiting. Miles disappeared into a corridor beneath fluorescent lights, and I followed until someone stopped me at a set of double doors and explained what would happen next. I remember the explanation as fragments. Full-thickness burns, airway monitoring, fluids, pain control, surgical evaluation, debridement, possible grafting. The doctor spoke carefully and did not promise things he could not know. That mattered to me later. At the time, I hated him for it. I wanted someone in a white coat to look me in the face and say my son would be fine, because that was what parents in hospital corridors were supposed to be given in exchange for not collapsing. Instead, I was told Miles was very sick. They had the resources he needed, and the next several hours mattered. Then the doors closed. I stood there with soot still on my sleeves. There was a black crescent beneath one of my fingernails. I stared at it until it stopped looking like dirt and started looking like evidence that the afternoon had actually happened. Scott arrived a little more than an hour later. He found me in the family waiting area, still wearing the same clothes, with a paper cup of water untouched beside me. He had changed nothing, except his location. Smoke clung to his shirt. There was dried mud across one knee from the lawn, and a small red scrape marked his wrist, where I must have caught him while fighting to get back into the house. He sat beside me without speaking. For several minutes, neither of us tried. His hand settled over mine. His thumb moved once across my knuckles and stopped. Only then did I notice he was shaking. The first surgery started that evening. A burn surgeon spent enough time with us beforehand to explain what they could see and what they still could not. Miles had significant third-degree burns across several areas, along with other burns of varying depth. They were watching his airway closely because of smoke exposure, although the initial findings gave them reasons to hope the damage there was manageable. The immediate work was about stabilizing him, cleaning damaged tissue, protecting what could be protected, and deciding what would need grafting later. I absorbed perhaps one sentence in 3. Scott absorbed everything. That was one of the differences between us when we were afraid. I narrowed until only the most immediate thing existed. Scott widened. He remembered names, sequences, instructions, medication times. He asked useful questions without turning the room into an interrogation. I watched the surgeon's eyes. That was all. When he left, Scott opened the Notes app on his phone and typed for almost a minute. Then he turned the screen off. "My parents shouldn't see him yet," he said. It was the first direct statement either of us had made about them since the fire. My body tightened before my mind caught up. Scott did not say they had caused it. He did not say Dad had tried to hurt Miles. He simply said that until we understood what had happened, Richard and Diane should not have access to our son without us knowing exactly what they might say to him. Part of me understood immediately. Another part recoiled. The last image I had of my father was his face turning white at the sight of the Zippo. That image had followed me all the way to Richmond. But a frightened expression was not proof. A lighter could be dropped. A fire could begin near something that had nothing to do with causing it. And my parents were still Miles's grandparents. That fact had not vanished just because something terrible had happened in their house. I told Scott I agreed we needed caution, but I was not ready to behave as if Dad had deliberately done something to Miles before anyone had established what the fire actually was. Scott looked at me for a long moment. His exhaustion made him seem older. He did not argue. That somehow bothered me more. A little before midnight, the surgeon returned. Miles had made it through the first procedure. The sentence did not mean what I wanted it to mean. It did not mean safe. It did not mean finished. It meant the first step had ended, and another one would come after it. Still, my knees weakened with relief. The doctor explained that Miles would remain closely monitored through the night. They expected additional procedures and a long recovery. The full extent of grafting needs would become clearer as damaged tissue declared itself over time. There was no miracle hidden in the update, but my son was alive. For that night, I took what I could get. Scott slept for 40 minutes in a chair with his head against the wall. I did not sleep. My phone had been filling with messages since before sunset. Most were from relatives and people who had heard there had been a fire. I ignored nearly all of them. Mom had called 6 times. Dad had called twice. Eric had sent a message saying he was driving over. I had forgotten, somehow, that my brother had not been at lunch. When he arrived after midnight, the hospital had given him enough time to imagine the worst. He looked as if he had dressed while moving. One side of his shirt collar was folded under itself, and his hair was still flattened where his headset had rested during work. He hugged me so hard my ribs hurt. Then he sat and listened, while I gave him the shortened version of what the doctors had said. His face changed when I mentioned the Zippo. Not disbelief exactly, resistance. Eric had spent most of our childhood refusing to accept Dad's version of anything on principle, then somehow grew into the adult most likely to defend him when outsiders criticized him. Families did that sometimes. They trained people into roles, then watched those roles reverse without anyone admitting the change. Eric asked what the fire marshal had actually said. When I told him the lighter had been found in an area they were treating as potentially significant to the origin, he pressed his lips together and looked toward the dark window at the end of the waiting room. That doesn't mean Dad tried to burn the house down. No one said it did. He glanced at Scott. Scott's expression did not change. Eric was right about one thing, and I knew it even then. A half-melted lighter was not the same as proof that my father had intentionally caused the fire. It certainly was not proof that he had known Miles was upstairs. The problem was that Dad's explanation, when it finally reached me, did not settle anything. He did not come to the hospital that night. Neither did Mom. Hospital staff routed any visitors through us. And neither of my parents came that night. The distance required no confrontation to make itself felt. In the early hours of the morning, Dad left me a voicemail. I listened once. He said the Zippo had probably been in the gallery for days. He sometimes used it near the study doors when he stepped outside, and he had been looking for it recently without thinking much about it. He sounded tired but composed. He said fire investigators had asked questions for hours, and that nothing had been determined. He did not say the word innocent. He did not need to. The entire message was built around coincidence. By morning, I had replayed it enough times that the words no longer sounded like words. They sounded like pieces being fitted into a space. I hated myself for thinking that. I hated myself a little more for noticing how quickly the explanation had arrived. Later that morning, Leah Benton called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She did not give me a case briefing. She did not tell me what evidence had been found or what investigators really thought. She asked me to confirm several details about the afternoon because I had been on the property. When we arrived, where everyone had been during lunch, whether I remembered appliances running in the gallery wing, whether I had seen Dad using the Zippo that day, I answered only what I knew. When I asked whether the fire had been electrical, she paused before answering. The scene was still under examination. Nothing final had been established. But the preliminary observations did not line up cleanly with a simple electrical malfunction in the way Dad had apparently suggested during questioning. That was all she gave me. The rest remained where it belonged with the investigation. I stared at the phone after the call ended. Dad had mentioned an electrical problem to investigators. I had not known that. I also could not remember any electrical problem in the gallery. That did not mean one had not existed. But I could feel how quickly that caveat was becoming a refuge. By midday, Miles was awake enough to respond to us for brief stretches. The first time his eyes opened and actually found mine, I stopped breathing. He looked smaller than he had the day before. Hospitals could do that to a person. They surrounded the body with machines, until even a 12-year-old who had spent the summer growing out of jeans could look fragile enough to fit in the space between two rails. I moved closer and let him see me without forcing him to turn his head. His mouth was dry, his voice came out rough. He asked where Dad was, then corrected himself. Grandpa. That nearly undid me. I told him Grandpa was not at the hospital yet. Miles closed his eyes again. A few minutes later, he asked for Grandma. There are decisions that look obvious afterward, because the consequences teach you what the choice should have been. Before the consequence, they are not always obvious. Mom had done plenty of things that irritated me over the years. She could be controlling. She could make help feel like a transaction, without ever naming a price. She cared too much about appearances, and not enough about how exhausting maintaining them could be for everyone else. But she had also kept Miles when he was 6, and had pneumonia, and Scott and I were too sick ourselves to function. She had sat beside him through a school concert when he was 9, and terrified of forgetting his part. She knew which cereal he hated and which side of his blanket he liked facing up. I was not looking at a stranger. I was looking at my mother through the lens of one horrific afternoon I did not yet understand. Miles wanted her. I told Scott I thought we should let her come in briefly, with one of us there. His jaw tightened. He did not say I was naive. He did not accuse me of choosing my parents over our son. He simply reminded me that no one knew enough about the fire yet, and Miles was drugged, frightened, and vulnerable. Whoever entered that room had the power to shape what he believed about what had happened. I heard him. I still made the choice. Mom came that afternoon. Dad did not. She looked smaller without the house around her. That sounds strange. But Diane Bellamy had always seemed partly constructed from her surroundings. Polished wood, clean counters, arranged flowers, clothes that never wrinkled in public. At the hospital, she wore yesterday's pants and a borrowed cardigan over a blouse that smelled faintly of smoke. She stopped when she saw Miles. Her hand went to her mouth. For several seconds, whatever else my mother was disappeared. There was only a grandmother looking at a child she loved and seeing bandages where skin should have been. She sat beside him carefully. I stayed on the other side of the bed. Miles opened his eyes when she touched the uninjured part of his hand. Mom leaned close enough that he would not have to strain to hear her. She told him he was safe. Then she said it. It was a terrible accident. 5 words, softly spoken, nothing dramatic. Miles's fingers loosened against the sheet. The tension that had been sitting between his brows eased. He looked toward me. I did not correct her. I did not know she was lying, or that Dad had set the fire. My mistake was letting a possibility sound like a fact because I wanted my son to be less afraid. Mom stayed less than 10 minutes. She did not talk about the house, insurance, investigators, or Dad. She kissed the side of Miles's forehead where the skin had not been injured, squeezed my shoulder as she left, and whispered that she would be nearby if we needed anything. Afterward, Miles slept more peacefully. For almost an hour, that felt like proof I had made the right choice. Then Scott returned from getting coffee. I told him Mom had come and repeated the one line she had said about the fire. He set both cups down very carefully. One lid had not been pushed on correctly, and a thin line of coffee escaped onto the counter. Scott watched it spread instead of wiping it. When he finally looked at me, his voice stayed low. "You let her tell him it was an accident." I reminded him that it still could have been. He nodded once. That was exactly his point. Could have been was not the same as was. I told him I had wanted Miles to stop being afraid. That was the only defense I gave. It was true. It was also incomplete. Scott cleaned the coffee with a paper towel, folded the wet towel in half, and threw it away. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Comfort isn't the same thing as certainty. There was no argument after that. His words irritated me because some part of me already understood them. By the second day, Miles had begun asking fewer questions. That should have reassured me. Instead, I started noticing the way he repeated Mom's word whenever something frightened him. It was an accident. When a nurse adjusted one of his dressings and he winced, he said it afterward as if reminding himself. When a monitor alarmed briefly because a sensor had slipped, his eyes opened wide, and he whispered it again. Accident. The word had become something solid for him to hold. I had helped put it there. I told myself we could correct it later if we had to. That thought should have bothered me more than it did. The next morning, hospital staff allowed me to help with a few small things around Miles's care that did not interfere with the clinical work. I learned where I could touch him safely. I learned how quickly pain could exhaust him. I learned that recovery was not a straight line from bad to better. Sometimes a successful hour was simply one in which he endured what had to be done without becoming overwhelmed. Between procedures, he slept. Scott handled calls. I answered questions when I could. Work had become a distant country. My manager told me not to think about it and started the leave process without making me explain more than necessary. Scott's team did the same. The world outside the hospital was still moving. Inside, time had reduced itself to medication cycles and doors opening. On the afternoon of the third day, Leah called again. This time she asked about the gallery. Not the fire itself. The room. She wanted to know whether I had been familiar with Dad's collection and whether I remembered seeing a particular tall walnut display cabinet in recent months. The description was specific enough that I knew exactly which one she meant. Dad had owned it for years. It had stood against the interior wall near one of the old clocks, a dark, narrow piece with brass hardware and glass panels that Dad hated anyone touching because fingerprints showed immediately. Leah did not tell me why she was asking. I did not press. I said I remembered the cabinet. Then she asked when I had last seen it. My answer died before I spoke, because suddenly I was not picturing the cabinet. I was picturing the wall. Christmas. A spring lunch. Miles standing near the clock in June. I could see the space in different seasons, different light, and the cabinet was not there. At least not in the memories arriving first. I told Leah I was not certain and would not guess. She thanked me and ended the call. I stayed by the window afterward, phone still in my hand. Behind me, Miles slept beneath a thin hospital blanket. Scott was reading through an update from the medical team. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and the coffee he had forgotten to finish. 3 days earlier, I had watched my father turn white at the Zippo. Since then I had kept room for innocent explanations. The lighter could have been dropped, the electrical issue could have existed, and the cabinet could have been moved. Nothing yet proved otherwise. But as I tried to remember the last time I had actually seen that tall walnut cabinet standing in my parents' gallery, one uncomfortable fact settled into place. I could remember exactly where it used to be. I just could not remember seeing it there for months. For the rest of that afternoon, I kept seeing the empty wall. Not the cabinet itself, the place where it should have been. There are certain objects you stop noticing after years of seeing them in the same place. They become part of a room's grammar. You do not consciously register them until someone moves one and suddenly the sentence looks wrong. Dad's walnut cabinet had been like that. Tall, narrow, dark enough that the glass panels always looked black from across the gallery. He kept smaller pieces inside it and complained whenever anyone touched the brass pulls without a cloth. I could remember it clearly at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, because Miles had leaned too close to one of the glass doors and left a perfect oval of his forehead against it. Dad had spent 10 minutes pretending to lecture him about respecting 18th century craftsmanship before handing him the polishing cloth and supervising the cleanup like it was an apprenticeship. But when Leah asked when I had last seen the cabinet, every recent memory gave me the same thing. A wall. Maybe a chair. Once, I thought, a narrow table. No cabinet. I did not tell myself that meant anything. Not yet. By the 4th day after the fire, Miles was awake for longer stretches. Awake still did not mean normal. Pain medication softened the edges of time for him, and exhaustion dragged him under without warning. Some hours he could follow a conversation. Others he answered with a nod or closed his eyes while we talked around him. The doctors were still discussing grafting plans. There were areas they could evaluate more confidently now, others they wanted to watch. I learned that severe burns had their own timetable, one that did not care how badly a mother wanted clean answers. The same seemed true of the fire. Scott had become the keeper of practical life. He handled forms, food, parking, insurance calls related to Miles, and the growing pile of messages from people who wanted to help but needed someone to tell them how. He also became strangely committed to buying our son things he believed a hospitalized 12-year-old would find entertaining. On the 5th day, he returned from the hospital gift shop with a brightly colored puzzle box. Miles stared at it from his bed. The front had a cartoon dinosaur wearing sunglasses. Scott placed it on the tray with the careful confidence of a man presenting a useful tool. Miles looked at me, then back at the box. "Did I get burned?" he asked quietly. "Or did I lose 4 years of brain development?" It took me by surprise. A laugh escaped before I could stop it. Not a polite breath through the nose. A real laugh. It sounded wrong in the room. For half a second, guilt snapped through me so quickly that I covered my mouth. Miles noticed. He looked tired, but there was the faintest irritation in his face. "Mom," that was all. He did not need a speech about healing. He did not need to tell me it was okay to smile. He simply looked at me, the way he always had when I was being unreasonable. I lowered my hand. Scott turned the box around, as if inspecting it for the first time, and admitted through a grimace that the dinosaur had seemed less juvenile under gift shop lighting. Miles almost smiled. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It mattered more than almost anything else that happened that day. For the first time since the fire, the room had held something other than pain, fear, or people speaking carefully. My son was still in there, not transformed into a symbol, not reduced to a patient number, a burn percentage, or a reason for adults to hate each other. Still Miles. I tried to remember that when my phone vibrated later. Mom had sent me 14 photographs, then 23 more. Under them was a message asking for help. The insurance company had requested an initial inventory of items lost or damaged in the fire, and because parts of the gallery had been badly affected, Mom was trying to reconstruct what had been there from photographs. She knew I had taken family pictures over the years and wanted me to look through them. The request did not feel sinister. That is important. At that stage, plenty of ordinary people who had lost a home would have been doing exactly the same thing, trying to remember what they owned, trying to prove what had been there, trying to put prices and names beside ashes. If I had received the message a week earlier, I would have helped without a second thought. I almost did then. Scott was downstairs getting food. Miles was sleeping after a dressing change. The room had gone quiet, except for the faint electrical hum of equipment and the ventilation system. I opened Mom's attachment. The first page was not the formal insurance file. It was a working loss list she had built from whatever documentation she and Dad had available. I recognized most of the names. Some meant nothing to me. Others immediately produced a shape. The long case clock Miles had teased Dad about, a pair of carved side chairs, the walnut cabinet, several small decorative objects Dad kept behind glass, an 18th century writing desk, a set of old golf clubs Dad had collected, because their wooden shafts and leather grips made them, in his mind, somehow more dignified than anything manufactured after 1965. The value estimates were not included on the version Mom sent me. Only descriptions and a column noting where each item had supposedly been. I read the cabinet line 3 times. Gallery, west interior wall. Destroyed. The word made my throat tighten. I did not know why. Destroyed was exactly what we would assume if a piece had been in a heavily burned room. The problem was that I could not remember the cabinet being there. I opened my own photo library. Most of my pictures from my parents' house were of people birthdays, holiday meals, miles near the clocks, Dad holding up wine as if he had invented grapes. The antiques lived in the backgrounds, which made those photographs unexpectedly useful. I scrolled backward. In a clear June photograph, the cabinet should have been several feet behind Miles. Instead, there was wall and the edge of a narrow table. An April photograph showed the same space without it. So did a wider January shot. Something tightened in my chest. I forced myself to stop. Furniture moved, rooms were rearranged, and Dad sometimes sent pieces out for restoration. I knew too little about how he managed the collection to turn 3 photographs into a conclusion. I typed Mom a short message, asking when the walnut cabinet had last been in the gallery. Her response came 10 minutes later. She said it had gone out for restoration at some point and been returned before the fire. No date, no shop, no details. Again, that was not proof of anything. I could almost hear Leah's careful voice from the phone. Only say what you know. So I did not reply with an accusation. Instead, I asked Mom who had restored it because I did not remember seeing it after spring. She did not answer immediately. When she did, she said Dad had handled that kind of thing. Then she sent another batch of photos. I sat back. The movement pulled at the muscles between my shoulders. I realized I had been hunched over the phone for nearly an hour. Miles shifted in the bed. His eyes opened. He watched me long enough to notice I was holding the phone too close to my face. "What are you doing?" I told him Grandma had asked me to help identify some things from the house. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then asked about Grandpa. It had become a pattern. Miles did not ask why Grandpa was absent so much as when he was coming. I told him they were still figuring out what had happened at the house. This time I did not supply the word accident or fill the silence for him. After a while, he closed his eyes. That evening, after Scott returned, I showed him the photographs. He did not react the way I expected. He did not say I had found something. He did not call my parents liars. He zoomed in on the same images, then asked whether Dad moved pieces often. I said yes, sometimes. He asked whether I knew who restored them. I said no. He handed the phone back. It was irritatingly reasonable. We had a pattern by then. Scott did not calm me by telling me I was wrong to worry. He calmed me by refusing to let fear turn questions into conclusions. I needed that more than I liked admitting. The next morning, Mom finally sent a name. Audrey Vale. I knew it. Not well. Audrey had appraised parts of Dad's collection over the years. I had met her twice, possibly 3 times, always at my parents' house. She was one of those people whose calm made everyone else seem slightly performative. Dad liked her because she knew enough to disagree with him without sounding impressed by herself. I did not have her number. Mom sent it when I asked. That surprised me. If she were trying to hide something, why give me the appraiser's contact? The thought made me feel ashamed of how suspicious I had become. Then another thought followed. Maybe because there was nothing to hide. I almost stopped there. Almost. But the cabinet kept sitting in the center of my mind, absent from every recent photograph. I called Audrey, while Scott sat with Miles. I explained that Mom had asked me to reconstruct the collection from family pictures, that the walnut cabinet appeared on the loss list, and that she said it had gone out for restoration before being returned. Audrey listened without interrupting. Then she asked which cabinet. I described it. She knew the piece. Audrey immediately corrected one assumption. The absence of her own restoration record did not prove no restoration had happened. Owners could use conservators, dealers, or transporters she never worked with. Then she mentioned something I had not expected. She had been scheduled to come to the Bellamy house on Tuesday, 3 days after the fire. Not for a casual visit, for a physical reappraisal. I looked at the date on the hospital room clock as if it might contradict her. Tuesday had already passed. I asked what the appraisal was for. She explained that Dad's insurer had requested updated on-site verification for the scheduled collection after coverage changes earlier in the year. The prior physical appraisal was old enough that they wanted current documentation before continuing at the requested levels. This was not some universal rule applying to every antique owner in America. It was specific to Dad's policy and collection. Audrey had been given a list of major scheduled pieces she expected to inspect in person. The walnut cabinet was one of them. I stopped moving. She continued talking, apparently unaware of what that one fact had done inside my head. The on-site visit had originally been set earlier in September. Dad had asked to move it. Then he had asked again. Tuesday, September 15th, was the date they finally settled on. I wrote the dates on the back of an envelope because my hands needed something to do. September 15 for the final appointment, after 2 reschedules. September 12 for the fire. 3 days. I asked why Dad had postponed. Audrey said she did not know. The reasons had been ordinary enough: scheduling conflict, house not convenient, something along those lines. She had not considered it unusual at the time. People postponed appointments. Audrey also reminded me that an item could legitimately be away for conservation, sale, loan, storage, or transport if records supported it. That was the point of provenance. Important pieces accumulated histories through appraisals, repairs, sales, photographs, and identifying marks. Fire could damage an object without erasing every trace of where it had been. I thanked Audrey and ended the call. For several minutes, I remained in the hospital corridor. A nurse pushed a cart past me. Someone laughed quietly near an elevator. A child several rooms down was crying about something ordinary enough that his mother promised him ice cream. Life had continued with offensive normality. I looked at the envelope again. The appraisal was 3 days after the fire. None of that proved Dad had burned anything, but the number of innocent explanations I needed was growing. By the end of that week, the house had become something I heard about more than saw. Scott returned once to collect clothes, Miles's school laptop, and a few things from home. He did not go to my parents' property. Investigators still controlled parts of the scene, and Mom and Dad were staying temporarily elsewhere. I had no desire to stand on the lawn again. Leah called one more time. The conversation was brief. She asked whether I had located photographs showing the gallery before the fire and whether I would be willing to provide copies of images taken during recent family visits. I said yes. I asked carefully whether they had confirmed the cabinet had not been in the room. She did not answer that question directly. Scene processing was still underway. Fire debris was complicated, particularly in an older house, filled with mixed materials and partially collapsed contents. Investigators had questions about what physical components should have been present for certain listed items, but nothing she told me should be treated as a final determination. I was beginning to appreciate her restraint. The investigation was accumulating questions rather than handing me conclusions. After the call, I emailed the photographs I could identify by date. Then I closed the laptop. I did not want to spend another hour turning every family picture into a crime scene. Miles needed help eating. The task was slow. A week earlier, I would not have noticed the mechanics of a 12-year-old lifting a fork. Now every movement mattered. Where his arm pulled, which positions hurt, how long he could sit before the effort exhausted him. He became irritated when I hovered. That was familiar enough to comfort me. He told me I was cutting his food too small. I ignored him and cut the next piece even smaller just to annoy him. He rolled his eyes. It was the closest thing we had to normal. Later, while Miles slept, I sorted the clearest photographs by date. The cabinet was absent from the images after winter. The writing desk appeared in spring but not August, while other pieces moved in ways I knew were ordinary. I wrote down only what I could support. The cabinet had once stood on the west wall. Recent photos did not show it there. Mom said it had gone for restoration and returned. Audrey did not know whether that happened, and it was scheduled for physical verification on September 15, after Dad postponed twice. Scott read the list that evening. He added nothing. He only asked whether I was ready to sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. I told him that sounded unnecessarily ambitious. The smile he gave me was exhausted and brief. We were learning that Miles's recovery also required ordinary things: sleep, food, work, and time, in which the mystery did not consume every available inch. That realization changed the way I handled the next call from Mom. She wanted to know whether I had found more pictures. I told her I had sent some to the fire investigator because Leah had requested dated images. Silence. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But Mom was rarely silent by accident. She said that was fine. Then she asked whether I had spoken to Audrey. I said yes. Another pause. Mom's voice remained controlled. She reminded me that Audrey was an appraiser, not an investigator, and that old furniture moved around all the time. That was true. I agreed. The call ended soon afterward. The call ended without an accusation. I still did not know what Mom knew, what Dad had done, or whether the fire was intentional. I had questions. By the 10th day, Miles had reached a point where the medical team could speak more confidently about the next stages. There would be further graft work. Pain management would remain difficult. Rehabilitation would begin in small ways before he felt ready for it. The doctor spent several minutes explaining the road ahead. I remember almost none of his exact words. I remember Miles listening. His face barely moved until the doctor mentioned that recovery could take a long time. His eyes shifted toward me. Not afraid exactly. Tired. I reached for the part of his hand I was allowed to touch. After the doctor left, Miles asked again when Grandpa might visit. This time he did not mention accident. I gave him the same answer I had settled on. They're still figuring out what happened. He stared at our joined hands. Then he nodded. The certainty Grandma had given him was thinning. I could see it. That hurt in a way I had not expected. A child should not have to learn that adults sometimes give reassurance because they need it to be true. That evening, Audrey returned a voicemail I had left earlier about the appraisal list. She confirmed the cabinet had been one of the pieces she expected to inspect. So, had several other high-value objects from the gallery. I asked whether there was anything unusual about that. There was not. Physical verification was exactly what the appointment was for. If a collection matched its documentation, the visit would have been tedious more than frightening measurements, photographs, condition notes, identification marks, updates, routine. Then Audrey paused. Her voice remained as dry and level as it had been in every conversation. If everything was where the schedule said it was, Joanna, the appointment should have been boring. I looked through the glass wall toward Miles. He was asleep. Scott sat beside him with the ridiculous dinosaur puzzle open across his knees, trying to fit together pieces he had apparently decided to complete himself. Audrey did not accuse my father of anything. Her point was simpler. If the collection matched its documentation, September 15th should have been routine. I ended the call and looked at the date written on the back of the envelope. Dad had postponed that ordinary appointment twice. Then, 3 days before it was finally supposed to happen, his gallery burned. And for the first time, I stopped wondering only why my father's Zippo had been near the fire. I started wondering why he had been so determined to delay someone from looking closely at what was supposed to be inside that room. For the next several days, September 15th stayed with me. The date proved nothing by itself, and I was not ready to turn an ugly pattern into an accusation. By the second week after the fire, Miles had moved beyond the first frantic phase of treatment into something slower and, in its own way, harder to watch. The emergency had stopped shouting. Now it breathed beside us. There were dressing changes that exhausted him before breakfast, consultations about grafting, small goals that would have sounded ridiculous before the fire, and suddenly mattered enough to make all three of us hold our breath. A few inches of movement, 10 more minutes sitting upright, a meal he could tolerate without nausea, a night when he slept longer than 2 hours at a time. The hospital room accumulated evidence of ordinary life trying to return. A sweatshirt from home draped over the chair. Miles's school tablet sat untouched near the window. The dinosaur puzzle Scott had bought as a joke by mistake was now almost finished, mostly because Scott refused to let a 12-year-old defeat him by declining to participate. I began carrying Mom's loss list because she kept asking me to check family photographs against it. I answered only what I could verify and stopped filling gaps with words like probably. The rule was simple. Say what I knew. Eric came to the hospital on the 12th day. He had visited before, but that afternoon was the first time Miles was awake enough to tolerate him for more than a few minutes. Eric brought nothing. I respected him for that immediately. Everyone else brought things. Books Miles could not concentrate on. Snacks he could not always eat. Stuffed animals meant for children half his age. One relative sent a balloon large enough to block the television until Scott quietly deflated it after midnight. Eric brought himself. He stood near the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, looking as though he could not decide whether staring at Miles was rude or looking away was worse. Miles solved the problem by asking why Uncle Eric looked like he had been arrested. Eric looked down at his wrinkled shirt. Apparently he had come straight from work. He told Miles that some people dressed badly without needing a criminal record. Miles accepted that answer and went back to resting. Laughter. While Scott stayed with him, Eric and I went downstairs for coffee. The hospital cafe smelled like over-roasted beans and disinfectant from the hallway. I showed him the list. Not all of it, just the cabinet, the photographs, the September 15th appraisal date. Eric leaned back in the plastic chair and rubbed a thumb against the cardboard sleeve around his cup. His first response was more practical than mine had been. Dad moved things all the time. Collectors loaned pieces. Restoration took months. The absence of a cabinet from a photograph did not make it missing. He was right. That irritated me. Not because I wanted him to be wrong, but because I wanted the pattern to become either clearly innocent or clearly terrible. Uncertainty required more energy than either conclusion. I told him Audrey had expected to physically inspect the cabinet. Eric shrugged. Then I told him Dad had postponed the appointment twice. That changed his face slightly. Only slightly. He still said it could mean nothing. Then I asked whether Dad had ever mentioned financial problems. Eric looked at his coffee. The pause was long enough to answer before he spoke. A few months earlier, Dad had asked him for money. Not $100. Not help covering a contractor for a week. $50,000. Eric had not given it to him. He could have covered part of it, but Dad refused to explain what it was for. When Eric pressed, Richard became offended at the idea that his own son required details before helping him. That sounded exactly like Dad. I asked why Eric had never told me. His expression hardened. Because he asked me, not you. The answer landed harder than it should have. Dad came to me with problems that needed smoothing, and to Eric with problems that needed proving. We had built different ideas of what that meant about his trust in us. I told Eric that $50,000 was not a small thing to keep quiet when we were now asking whether Dad had been under financial pressure. He reminded me that at the time there had been no fire, no Zippo, no appraisal question. He had thought Dad was embarrassed about retirement. That made sense. Richard Bellamy had spent most of his adult life being the person other people asked for financial advice. The idea of explaining to either of his children that he needed money would have been humiliation enough. Explaining why might have felt impossible. Eric had interpreted the request as pride. Maybe it had been, maybe it still was. I wrote nothing down. This was my brother telling me something about our father, not an audit. Before we went back upstairs, Eric noticed one of the family photographs open on my phone. It showed Mom's dining room during a holiday dinner. Two carved chairs sat against the far wall. Eric pointed at one. He called it a Queen Anne chair. I told him it was not. He insisted Dad had spent our entire childhood calling it that. I said Dad had spent our entire childhood correcting us for calling every old chair the fancy chair, which was not evidence. We stared at the image for several seconds. Then Eric zoomed in. A label from a moving company was stuck crookedly underneath the seat. Neither of us knew what kind of chair it was. We started laughing, quietly. The kind of laugh that came from being children together before either of us remembered we were adults standing in a hospital where my son was recovering from burns. Eric wiped beneath one eye and handed the phone back. For all we know, Dad made half those names up just to make us feel stupid. It was not true. Dad knew his collection. That had never been the problem. But the joke loosened something between us. For 10 minutes, Eric was not the brother defending Dad, and I was not the sister gathering photographs for investigators. We were just two people who had spent childhood dinners being told not to lean back on expensive chairs. Then the elevator doors opened. The hospital returned. 3 days later, Audrey called me. She had been working through some older appraisal material because the insurer had asked her to preserve and provide records related to the scheduled collection. She was careful about what she could discuss with me, especially where current claim investigation crossed into confidential material. But there was one thing she could point me toward, because it was already public: a dealer archive. One of Dad's listed pieces, not the walnut cabinet, had appeared in a publicly accessible sale record earlier that year. It was a small Federal-era writing desk. I knew the desk. Dad used to keep a shallow bowl of old keys on top of it, none of which opened anything in the house. Miles had once spent an entire afternoon trying them indoors, until Dad threatened to start charging him locksmith fees. The desk also appeared on Mom's post-fire loss list. Destroyed. Gallery. I sat in the hospital family lounge with my laptop open while Audrey walked me through where to look. The listing did not show my father's name, but Audrey pointed out a repaired split, distinctive inlay, mismatched brass pull, and older appraisal details that made a coincidental match unlikely. She still insisted the dealer record needed proper verification before anyone treated it as conclusive. What she left me with was enough to investigate. A public record from months before the fire, and Mom's list saying the same desk had been destroyed on September 12th. The mismatched brass pull appeared in both sets of photographs. I closed the laptop, opened it again, and found the record unchanged. That evening, I showed Scott. He read everything without speaking. Scott read everything without speaking, asked how strong Audrey thought the identification was, and accepted my answer. Strong enough to investigate, not strong enough for us to declare anything. The desk was still there. Destroyed. That word again. I called Mom the next morning, not Dad. I had not spoken directly to him since the fire. I did not know whether that was because I was protecting myself or punishing him. Probably both. Mom answered from the short-term rental where she and Dad were staying while the house remained inaccessible. I skipped everything that would have counted as social conversation. I asked whether Dad had sold the Federal writing desk before the fire. There was a pause. Not the sharp silence of shock. Something more measured. Mom said Dad had sold 1 or 2 pieces over the last year. He owned them. He was allowed to sell them. I agreed. That was not the question. The question was why a desk sold months earlier appeared on a list of objects destroyed by the fire. Mom's breathing changed. Just slightly. She said the list was preliminary. Everything had been chaotic. Some descriptions might have been copied from older insurance schedules before they knew exactly what was in the damaged rooms. That explanation was possible. Again, possible. I asked whether she would correct the list. She said the insurance people would sort it out. I stopped there. I did not accuse her of fraud or arson. I listened to the explanation she had chosen. By the time the call ended, one thing had become clearer to me. Selling the desk was not the wrongdoing I was worried about. Dad could sell every chair, clock, cabinet, and ridiculous bowl of keys he owned. It was his property. He could burn the money afterward if he wanted. The moral line sat somewhere else. If the desk had been sold in March, then it had not burned in September. If Mom knew that and still told an insurer it had been destroyed by the fire, the lie was not historical. It was current. It had happened after the helicopter. After Miles had been carried from the house. After Mom had stood on the lawn and watched dressings cover her grandson's skin. That was what made my hands go cold. I thought back to her first sentence while the helicopter waited. Hope insurance covers my vintage furniture. The words had enraged me because of their timing. Now the timing meant something different. Insurance had not entered Mom's mind later. After shock wore off and practical concerns, it had been there while the grass still flattened under the helicopter blades. I did not know what that meant, but I could no longer hear the sentence as simple selfishness. Something had been active behind it. A concern, a fear, maybe only money, maybe something more. I closed my eyes and saw Mom staring at the damaged gallery while Miles was being loaded into the aircraft. I had thought she was mourning furniture. Now I wondered whether she had been calculating what the fire had erased. That thought frightened me enough that I pushed it away. It was still speculation. I was getting better at recognizing the difference. A week later, Miles asked me the question I had known was coming. He had finished a difficult therapy session and was exhausted in the particular way. Pain could exhaust him, not sleepy, exactly, but emptied. Scott had gone downstairs to return a call from work. I was helping Miles adjust the blanket when he looked toward the window instead of at me. Why did Grandma say it was an accident? My hands stopped. There was no accusation in his voice. That made it worse. He was trying to make the adult world match itself. Grandma had said one thing. Investigators were still asking questions. Grandpa had not visited. Mom and Dad kept using careful language. At 12, he did not need to understand insurance schedules or provenance. He only needed the basic rules to stay consistent. I sat down beside him. I told him Grandma had said something she hoped was true before anyone knew enough to promise it. Miles thought about that. His eyes stayed on the window. So she didn't know? I could have said no. It would have been easy. Instead, I told him I did not know what Grandma knew. That was the truth. His mouth tightened. He picked at a loose thread along the edge of the blanket with 2 fingers. I waited. After a while, he said he wished grown-ups would stop saying things just because they wanted them to be true. He said he wished grown-ups would stop saying things just because they wanted them to be true. I had no defense. I had let Mom use the word accident because I wanted it to soothe him. I apologized for letting a possibility sound like a fact. Miles nodded and asked for water, moving on before I could turn the moment into a lesson. Later that night, I checked the few pieces I could identify with confidence. Some were visible in recent photographs, and some were not. The desk was different because it had a trail outside the house, a public sale record rather than memory alone. If that trail held up, then at least one thing Mom said had been destroyed in the fire had left the collection months earlier. The next day, Eric came back. I showed him. His reaction was different this time. He still did not say Dad set the fire. He still did not say Mom had committed fraud. But he stopped offering explanations before I finished speaking. That was new. He studied the dealer photographs carefully. When I pointed out the repaired leg and mismatched pull, his face tightened. He remembered the desk too. More importantly, he remembered helping Dad move a crated piece out of the house sometime in late winter. At the time, Dad had said it was going for restoration. Eric could not swear it was the desk. The crate had been closed. He had not asked. He had simply helped load it because Dad said it needed to go. I asked whether he remembered where it went. He did not. He remembered only a van, 2 men, and no company name. Then he caught himself before turning uncertainty into more than it was. I'm not saying that proves anything. I told him I knew. This time, neither of us was trying to win. The distinction mattered. Eric had spent days defending Dad from conclusions no one had actually made. I had spent days fearing conclusions I was not ready to make. Now we were finally standing in the same place. Not certainty. Evidence. A week earlier, the cabinet had been a memory problem. Now the desk had a documented life outside the house. And somewhere between those two facts sat a question neither of us could answer yet. How much of Dad's collection had still existed when the fire began? That evening, Audrey sent me one final message. She had forwarded the public dealer information through the proper channels and would let the investigators and insurer handle verification. No speculation. No commentary. Just that. I appreciated the boundary. I had started understanding how dangerous speculation could become when it was wrapped around people you loved. Miles slept while I sat beside him. The room was dim, except for the monitor glow and a strip of hallway light beneath the door. Scott had gone home for a few hours to shower and bring back clean clothes. My phone lay face down on the table. For once, I did not pick it up. I looked at my son instead. His healing body was the only evidence in the story that did not need interpretation. Something had happened in that house. Whatever my parents had intended, whatever they had known, whatever they had hidden or not hidden, Miles carried the consequence without having chosen any part of it. That thought steadied me. I did not need to prove Dad evil. I did not need to prove Mom had lied. I needed to stop protecting myself from questions simply because I was afraid of their answers. The desk had been sold months before the fire. Mom's list said it burned. Dad had postponed an appraisal that would have physically checked whether it was there. Those facts could still have explanations, but they could not all be ignored. I turned the loss list over on the table so I would not keep reading it. Then I looked through the dark window at my own reflection. For the first time, the question was no longer whether my father's Zippo had somehow ended up near the fire. It was no longer even whether the fire had been an accident. The question had moved somewhere colder. If the antiques my parents said had burned were already gone before September 12th, where had they actually been when the house caught fire? By the fourth week after the fire, I had learned there were two kinds of uncertainty. One was honest. It came from doctors who would tell me exactly what they knew about Miles's skin, exactly what they still had to watch, and exactly where recovery might surprise us. It came from Audrey, who could look at a public sale record and say it was significant without pretending it was final proof. It came from Leah, who guarded the boundary between questions and conclusions, even when I wanted her to cross it for me. The other kind of uncertainty was shaped. It left just enough empty space for someone else to step in and tell you what you should remember. Mom called on a Thursday afternoon while Miles was finishing therapy. I was sitting near the window with my laptop open but untouched. Through the glass wall I could see Scott standing beside Miles, close enough to help if needed but not hovering. Our son had reached the stage where some movement was necessary precisely because it hurt. Watching him work through that contradiction had become one of the most brutal parts of recovery. My phone lit up with Diane Bellamy's name. I almost let it ring out. Then I thought of the questions I had already refused to answer with assumptions. I picked up. Mom did not start with the fire. She asked about Miles. Not casually. She wanted to know whether the therapy had gone well, whether he was sleeping, whether the doctors had changed anything. I answered in broad terms. His medical information belonged to him before it belonged to anyone else, and that boundary had become easier to keep after the mistakes of the first week. For several minutes, she sounded only like a grandmother, being kept away from a child she loved. That part was real. I could hear it in the way her voice tightened when I said he had been able to tolerate a longer session that morning. She breathed out as if she had been holding something since I answered. Then the conversation shifted. Not dramatically. Mom had always been too skilled for dramatic shifts. She said investigators had spoken with Dad again about the patio and the time before the smoke appeared. They were making, In her words, far too much out of small details from an afternoon everyone remembered through panic. I did not answer. She continued. Dad had been outside with us. We all knew that. When the smoke appeared, he had been sitting right there on the patio. That was true. I could picture him. Phone face down near his glass, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee. Scott talking about golf. Miles stretched along the low wall before he went back inside. Mom's voice softened further. She said she worried that because I had been traumatized, I might start doubting things I had originally known clearly. Then she gave me the version she wanted. Richard had been outside practically the entire time. I knew that, didn't I? The word yes rose so automatically that it reached the back of my teeth. I stopped before I said it. That frightened me more than if she had shouted. Because for 1 second, agreeing had felt easier than remembering. I moved away from the therapy room window and sat down. I know he was outside when we saw the smoke. Mom went quiet. I could almost feel her waiting for the rest. I did not give it. She said that was what mattered. I was no longer sure it was. After the call, I left my phone on the chair beside me and watched Miles through the glass. Scott glanced toward me. He knew my face well enough to notice something had changed. He waited until Miles's therapist was finished before asking. I told him what Mom had said. Not word for word. I did not need to recreate the conversation like testimony. I told him she wanted me to confirm that Dad had been outside with us, essentially the whole time before the fire. Scott listened without interrupting. When I admitted I had almost agreed, his eyebrows lifted slightly. I expected frustration. Instead, he asked what I actually remembered. I told him the truth. Dad had been outside. Then he had gone in. Then he had come back. The problem was that until Mom insisted those minutes did not matter, I had never tried to measure them. Scott rested both hands on the back of the empty chair across from me. If you don't know, say you don't know. The sentence was simple enough to sound obvious. It was also something I had been surprisingly bad at with my parents. They had never asked me to invent entire stories for them. They rarely needed to. What they relied on was smaller. My willingness to make rough edges smooth, to fill in missing intentions with generous ones, to assume the version that created the least conflict. I had always called that fairness. Maybe sometimes it was. But fairness did not mean turning uncertainty into certainty, because someone I loved preferred the cleaner version. That evening, I started with the photographs, not the collection photographs this time, the family ones. Mom had sent several from the patio because she had wanted everyone together. Most were useless for timing beyond the metadata. One showed me standing beside Miles near the stone wall. Another had Scott half turned away because someone had said his name just as Mom took it. Then there was the photograph from 2:41. Dad stood behind Miles. His hand rested on my son's shoulder. Everyone was outside. The picture proved that much. Nothing more. I opened my text history from that afternoon. There was a message from work I had ignored. A photo Scott had sent me of Miles stealing potatoes off my plate time-stamped earlier. A short message from Eric saying he was not going to make lunch. The afternoon began rebuilding itself through fragments that had never been intended as evidence. I remembered carrying the platter inside after dessert. Dad had not been in the kitchen. I remembered Mom folding napkins. I remembered Scott talking to me about the system's rollout. I remembered Dad's empty chair. Then I remembered something I had not thought about since the fire. His coffee. Before he disappeared, the cup had been beside his phone. When he returned, he brought neither cup nor plate. He simply came through the doors, put his phone down, and sat. It was not evidence, but the memory anchored the sequence. I wrote down only what I could place. Dad on patio before he left. Dad absent while I carried platter inside. Dad returns. Group still outside. Miles later goes in for headphones. Visible smoke after that. I stared at the page. There was still no duration. Scott helped me work backward without supplying memories for me. That distinction mattered. He did not say, "Remember, your dad was gone 12 minutes." He asked what external markers I had. The group photograph. Eric's message. The time of a work notification. A photo Scott had taken of a ridiculous golf ball Dad had shown him because it had some old club logo printed on it. That photograph was time-stamped 2:34. Dad was not in it. Scott remembered taking it because Richard had gone inside just before he snapped the picture. He would not swear to the exact minute without the metadata, but the photograph gave us a lower boundary. At 2:41, Dad was back and standing behind Miles in Mom's group shot. That alone did not make 11 minutes. Another piece did. Mom had sent a photo to her sister at 2:30 showing the dessert table. Dad's chair was empty in the background. Scott had noticed him get up shortly before that. By comparing what each of us independently remembered with the timestamps, the gap looked close to 10 or 11 minutes. Not 30. Not 2. Enough to matter. I did not like the number once it existed. 11 minutes felt too specific. Specific things demanded explanations. The next morning, I called Leah. I did not tell her I had solved anything. I told her Mom had asked me to confirm Dad had been outside practically the whole time, and that after checking photographs, I no longer believed I could honestly say that. Leah asked what I could say. I gave her the sequence and the timestamps. She asked whether Scott had independently remembered Dad leaving. I said yes. She did not tell me whether it changed the investigation. She only asked us to preserve the original photographs and not edit their metadata. Then she thanked me for separating what I remembered from what I had reconstructed later. That sentence stayed with me, because the difference was becoming central to everything. Dad had been outside when we saw smoke. That was a memory. Dad had been outside the entire time before smoke. That was a story. And I had nearly helped Mom convert one into the other. 2 days later, Mom asked if we could meet. I chose the hospital cafe rather than the room. Miles had no business carrying the weight of an adult conversation he had not asked to hear. Mom arrived in a dark coat, even though the afternoon was warm. She looked more tired than she had on her first hospital visit. There were fine lines around her mouth. I did not remember seeing before the fire, though I knew they had not appeared in 3 weeks. Trauma changed what you noticed. We sat at a table near the wall. I told her I had checked the photographs and could not confirm Dad had remained outside the entire time. Mom did not react immediately. She folded her hands. Then she said Dad had gone inside briefly, perhaps, but that was not the same as anything sinister. I agreed. That seemed to confuse her. I was beginning to understand how much of our old dynamic depended on me arguing against the worst interpretation so she could pull me toward the best one. I did not need to do either. Dad being inside for 11 minutes did not prove arson. I did not have to pretend those minutes did not exist just because arson was not yet proven. Mom looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, the polished certainty was gone for a moment. She said she had not seen Miles since that brief hospital visit. She knew he was getting better, only through what I chose to tell her. She had spent nearly a month waking up every morning, knowing her grandson had been hurt in her home and that she was not allowed near him. Her voice broke on the last part. I did not think she was pretending. That was one of the hardest things about what followed. If Mom had been cruel every moment of her life, all of this would have been easier. But she loved Miles. I believed that then. I still believe it now. Love was not the same thing as safety. Love was not the same thing as truth. Those distinctions had taken me too long to learn. I told her I understood that being separated from him hurt. She looked up quickly, relief flickering across her face, as if acknowledgement meant the boundary was about to move. It did not. Miles still had questions about the fire. We still did not know what had happened. Scott and I had decided no one would discuss cause with him unless we could keep the language factual. Mom's mouth tightened. Then came the sentence that changed the conversation. He needs his family. I looked at her. The words sounded loving, but underneath them was the old assumption that family meant access and an obligation to make room. I no longer accepted that equation. I told her Miles needed safety and truth first. Family did not become irrelevant, but it did not outrank those things. Mom leaned back. She did not argue loudly. She did not call me ungrateful. She only said investigators were turning a terrible accident into something larger because people always looked for someone to blame after a tragedy. There was the word again, accident. This time I heard it differently. Not as comfort. As a conclusion she wanted maintained. I asked whether she knew what Dad had been doing during the 11 minutes he was inside. Her eyes moved away from mine. She said he could have been doing any number of things. That was true. I waited. She never offered one. When I returned upstairs, Miles was awake. Scott had stepped out to speak with a nurse, and the room was unusually quiet. Miles watched me put my bag down. I knew from his face that he had been waiting to ask something. He had become more observant since the fire. Or maybe he had always been observant, and I had become less dismissive of what he noticed. He asked whether Grandma had been there. I said yes. His fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. Then he asked the question. I had hoped. Part of me hoped he had forgotten. Why had I let Grandma tell him it was an accident if I did not know? The words were not angry. They were disappointed, which was worse. I sat beside him. My first instinct was to explain that he had been frightened, that Grandma loved him, that reassurance had seemed merciful. None of it answered what he had asked, so I did not use it. I told him I had made a mistake. Not by letting Grandma love him, not by wanting him calmer, by letting a possibility sound like a fact, because it was the answer I wanted too. Miles looked at the bandaging over one arm. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he told me he had believed it because I was standing there when Grandma said it. That landed harder than anything Mom had said downstairs. He had not trusted the word because Diane Bellamy spoke with authority. He had trusted it because I had not corrected her. My silence had endorsed it. I reached toward him, then stopped until he shifted his uninjured hand toward mine. I held it carefully. I told him that from now on, if I did not know something, I would say I did not know. If investigators learned something we could explain without overwhelming him, Scott and I would tell him. And if adults disagreed, we would not solve that disagreement by giving him whichever answer sounded least frightening. Miles absorbed that with the exhausted seriousness that had become too common on his face. Okay, one word. Enough. He did not absolve me. He did not need to. Later that evening, Scott returned with a stack of clean clothes and a sandwich I had not asked for but ate anyway. Miles was asleep. I told Scott about the conversation. He sat near the foot of the bed, elbows on his knees. I expected him to tell me he had warned me. He did not. That would have made the moment easier because I could have resented him instead of sitting with what I had done. I told him something I should have said weeks earlier. He had been right to want a stricter safety boundary after the fire. Not because Dad had been proven guilty. Not because Mom had been proven complicit. Because Miles had been vulnerable, and we had not understood what information the adults around him might carry into that room. I had treated Scott's caution like premature judgment when part of it had simply been parenting. Scott looked down at his hands. Then he said he had also gone too far in his own mind during those first hours. He had looked at Dad as if the fire proved he had knowingly put Miles in danger. We did not know that. Not then. The distinction mattered. Neither of us needed the other to be completely wrong in order to admit where we had been. The next day, Leah called to confirm she had received the photographs. I asked one question. Did the 11-minute gap matter? She chose her words carefully. The sequence was consistent with Richard having time inside the house before returning to the patio, and his presence outside when smoke was first noticed did not establish where he had been earlier. Nothing more. But I no longer needed more from her. I knew what the photographs showed. Dad had gone inside. Dad had come back. Visible smoke appeared afterward. Mom wanted that first part softened, until only the last part remained. I spent the following evening looking at the 2:41 photograph. Dad stood behind Miles. His face looked relaxed. Mom had framed everyone carefully. Scott was beside me. I was holding one hand up against the sun. Miles leaned into his grandfather. Anyone seeing the 2:41 photograph without context would see a normal family lunch, a relaxed grandfather with his hand on his grandson's shoulder, nothing burning yet. I closed the image. 11 minutes earlier, Dad had been somewhere inside the house. Mom wanted me to say those minutes did not matter. I had refused. But refusal did not answer the question that had begun pressing harder than anything else. If those 11 minutes were as meaningless as she claimed, why was my mother working so hard to make them disappear? Once I stopped asking why Mom wanted the 11 minutes softened, another question became harder to avoid. Why had she cared so much about the rest of the afternoon looking ordinary? The answer was not in one new clue, but in the pattern already forming. The lunch date, Mom's insistence that Scott and Miles come, the photographs, Dad's absence and return, then the smoke. Together, those details stopped feeling random. Eric was the first one to say something that pushed the pattern forward. He came to the hospital near the end of the 5th week, when Miles had begun spending more time out of bed under supervision and resenting almost every minute of it. The medical team considered that progress. Miles considered it evidence that adults had a disturbing definition of improvement. Scott was helping him through a short exercise when Eric and I stepped into the hallway. My brother had found an old text thread with Mom. He had been looking for messages about the crate he once helped Dad move, hoping some forgotten company name or date might be buried there. He found nothing useful about the crate. What he found instead was the lunch. Mom had originally invited him for the following weekend. Then she changed it. Not casually, she sent multiple messages asking whether he could make September 12th instead. When Eric said work might interfere, she pushed. She told him she wanted everyone together because the summer had passed without a proper family picture. He had forgotten all of it because he had not gone. On the screen, the messages looked ordinary. The kind of thing mothers sent when adult children became difficult to gather in one place. But the date mattered now. September 12th, 3 days before the appraisal. Eric stood beside the window at the end of the corridor and scrolled upward. He had another message from Mom 2 days before the lunch, asking him again whether he could at least come for the photo. That phrase stayed with me. At least come for the photo. Eric looked uncomfortable. She always wanted pictures. I knew what he meant. Mom had photographed everything. Birthdays, first days of school, awkward graduations, terrible haircuts. She had an entire drawer of printed photographs because trusting digital storage alone struck her as irresponsible. Wanting a picture was not suspicious. That was the problem with almost every detail in this story. Nothing looked wrong until placed beside something else. I asked Eric whether Mom had ever pushed that hard about a random Saturday lunch before. He did not answer immediately. Then he shook his head. That still was not proof. But it was one more thing we could say honestly. Diane had not simply accepted that we happened to be free on September 12th. She had worked to make sure we were there. The appraisal deadline supplied the second piece. Audrey had already told me the on-site physical verification was set for September 15th. That week, she confirmed something else through the limited information she was allowed to discuss. Dad had not merely postponed the appointment twice. By the final reschedule, there was little room left to move it again without the insurer asking more questions about the requested coverage levels. She did not suggest that meant he planned a fire. She did not need to. The calendar did the work on its own. Dad had an appointment approaching that would require someone to physically verify major pieces in the collection. At least one of those pieces had already appeared in a dealer record months earlier. Another had vanished from recent family photographs. Dad had tried twice to delay the inspection. 3 days before the date he could no longer easily avoid, the gallery burned. And on the day it burned, Mom had worked unusually hard to make sure the family was gathered outside. I hated the shape of it, not because it was complete, because it was becoming coherent. Scott and I went back through the timeline one more time that evening, this time with Eric present. We did not do it because we thought we were investigators. We were trying to understand what our own memories could and could not establish. Dad disappeared from the patio for roughly 10 or 11 minutes. He returned. Then Mom took the group photograph at 2:41. Miles was beside him. Dad's hand rested on Miles's shoulder. Visible smoke did not appear until later. Miles went back inside for his headphones only after Dad had returned to the patio. That sequence mattered more than I had understood. If someone looked only at the moment smoke became visible, Dad appeared to be exactly where an innocent homeowner might be, outside, with his family, in a photograph taken shortly beforehand, acting normal. I stared at the image again. The sunlight washed one side of my face pale. Scott was looking toward Mom rather than the camera. Miles leaned slightly against Dad. Dad's expression was calm enough that nothing in it suggested what would happen minutes later. It was not an alibi. I understood that now. A photograph showing where someone stood at 2:40. One did not prove where they had been at 2:30. But people did not experience events like lawyers. They experienced them in impressions. If investigators had asked me on the lawn that first afternoon where Dad had been when we noticed smoke, I would have said outside with us. That would have been true. If someone asked whether the day had seemed normal before the fire, I would have said yes. Also true. If someone asked whether Dad appeared panicked before smoke showed, I would have said no. True again. Enough true fragments arranged in the right order could make an entire story feel true, even if the most important minutes were missing. That was what unsettled me. Not the possibility that Mom and Dad needed us to lie. The possibility that they needed us to tell the truth selectively. Eric pushed back when I said that aloud. He reminded me that we still did not know why Dad had gone inside. We did not know whether the fire was intentionally set. We did not know whether Mom had arranged lunch for any reason beyond wanting family together. He was right. I told him so. He looked almost annoyed by my agreement. We had spent so many weeks bracing for opposite positions that neither of us quite knew what to do when I was not going to accuse my parents of building a cover story simply because the pattern made me uncomfortable. But I was also done pretending the pattern did not deserve examination. A few days later, Leah asked Scott and me to confirm one narrow part of the timeline again. She did not present a theory. She asked when Dad returned to the patio relative to the photograph, and when Miles later went back inside. We answered separately. Our memories matched on the important order. Dad came back first. Mom took the group picture. Miles returned inside later for his headphones. Smoke became visible after that. Leah did not tell me why the sequence mattered. By then, I no longer expected investigators to narrate their thinking for me. But once the call ended, I sat beside Scott and looked at the same sequence from another angle. If Dad had intentionally done something during those 11 minutes, he had already returned to the patio before Miles went upstairs. That distinction was not small. It changed the way I thought about the most painful question in the entire story. Did Dad know Miles was inside? I had been avoiding the question because every answer hurt. If Dad knew, then the man who had taught my son how to polish brass and identify old wood had knowingly left him inside a dangerous house. If Dad did not know, then something else was true. He had created a danger he believed he could control. Then the control failed. The timeline was beginning to support the second possibility more than the first. Miles went back in after Dad had returned outside. It happened casually. He remembered his headphones. He asked me. I told him to go. Dad was looking at his phone. Mom was dealing with containers. Neither of them reacted, because there was no obvious reason for anyone to react. If they had been waiting for the house to become visibly dangerous, they might not have noticed one 12-year-old slip back through the doors. The thought made my stomach turn, not because it excused anything, because it made the scenario more human and more terrible at the same time. Nobody had to want Miles burned. They only had to believe they had arranged the world carefully enough that no one would be. That kind of arrogance could be almost as dangerous as malice. Scott struggled with that distinction. I could see it in the way he paced our kitchen during the rare nights one of us slept at home. By then we had developed a rotation around the hospital, because exhaustion had stopped being a badge of devotion and started becoming a liability. One of us stayed with Miles. The other went home, showered, handled work for a few hours if possible, and tried to remember we owned a refrigerator. On one of my nights home, Scott stood at the counter staring at the group photo on my laptop. He admitted that from the first moment he saw Dad react to the Zippo, he had mentally crossed a line investigators had not crossed. He had looked at Richard as though the fire itself proved he had knowingly put Miles in danger. I understood why. Scott had watched firefighters carry our son out of that house. His body had been the one holding me back from the doorway while I fought him. He had heard Dad ask about golf clubs. Anger had filled the empty spaces before evidence could. But if the timeline was accurate, Dad had been back outside before Miles returned upstairs. Scott rubbed both hands over his face. That matters. It did. Truth did not become less important because part of it helped someone we suspected. I had spent too much of my life doing the opposite, softening facts for family. I was not going to correct that by hardening facts against them. Dad might have caused the fire. Dad might have committed fraud. Neither possibility gave me the right to quietly upgrade him into a man who knowingly burned his grandson if the evidence did not support it. Eric understood that distinction too. In fact, he insisted on it more strongly than anyone. When I told him the timeline suggested Miles re-entered after Dad returned, he exhaled hard and sat down. For a moment he looked relieved, then guilty for being relieved. If he didn't know Miles was inside, that matters. I told him yes. It did. Eric looked at me as though expecting an argument. I did not give him one. A person could be guilty of one terrible thing without being guilty of every terrible thing we could imagine. That was not mercy. It was accuracy. And accuracy was beginning to feel like the only ground solid enough to stand on. The next significant piece did not come from Leah or Audrey. It came from Mom's own photographs. Eric sent me a second image from the lunch. Mom had texted it to him while he was still at work, apparently trying to make him regret not coming. It showed Dad seated at the patio table after returning from inside. The image was time-stamped 2:43. Under it, Mom had written that Eric was missing the first decent family afternoon in months. I read the sentence several times. Again, nothing criminal. Again, ordinary. But it made me remember how determined she had been to keep everyone outside after lunch. I had offered to help carry more dishes in. Mom told me not to bother. She said she would deal with everything later. Scott had suggested moving inside because the sun was getting uncomfortable near one side of the patio. Mom found a shaded spot instead. Dad came back. Mom took pictures. We stayed outside. At the time, I had interpreted it as hosting. Diane liked people where she had arranged them. That had been true my entire life. Now the same behavior carried another possible meaning. Keep everyone together. Keep everyone visible. Keep the afternoon looking ordinary. I did not like how naturally the idea fit her. That night, I could not sleep. I sat at our kitchen table, with only the light above the stove on, and remembered being 9 years old, at one of Mom's charity dinners. Dad had spilled wine on a white tablecloth minutes before guests arrived. I had run to tell Mom. She gave me a towel, showed me how to blot the stain, turned the tablecloth so the damp spot faced the wall, and told me something I heard versions of for years afterward. Don't make things harder than they have to be. It had not been cruel advice. Most of the time it was practical. Do not panic. Fix what can be fixed. Keep moving. I had built useful parts of myself from that lesson. But somewhere along the way, I had also learned that when my parents created a mess, being a good daughter meant helping the room look normal before anyone else walked in. I closed my eyes. The memory was enough. I did not need 10 more childhood examples to prove the point. Whatever my parents had done on September 12th, they knew one thing about me very well. I would instinctively search for the least damaging explanation. They did not need to ask me to lie. They needed me to remember them generously. The betrayal in that possibility was quieter than the fire. It hurt differently. I had thought being the reliable daughter meant they trusted me. Now I had to consider whether reliability had made me useful. The distinction stayed with me when I returned to Miles the next morning. He had just finished a painful therapy session and was exhausted enough that even conversation seemed heavy. I did not sit beside him and tell him I had discovered his grandparents might have invited us as part of a cover story. That would have served me, not him. I wanted someone to understand how violated I felt. Miles was not the person whose job it was to carry that. He was 12. He had scars still healing under bandages. He had already been given too much adult uncertainty, so I helped adjust his pillow. I gave him water. I waited. After several minutes, he asked whether investigators knew why Grandpa had been inside before the fire. I told him they were still working on it. He watched me carefully. Was he inside when I went back? The question stopped me. It was exactly the kind of thing I had promised not to answer with whatever sounded kindest. I told him what I knew. Grandpa had already come back outside before Miles went in for his headphones. Miles looked down. Something eased in his face. Not much. Enough for me to see. He did not say what he was thinking. I did not put words in his mouth. The fact mattered to him. I let it matter without explaining what it should mean. After he fell asleep, I looked once more at the group picture. Dad's hand on Miles's shoulder. Mom behind the phone. A normal afternoon preserved at its most harmless-looking moment. It answered the question that had bothered me most. Why invite family to a house you intended to damage? Because normal people could create normal memories around an abnormal act without knowing they were doing it. I still had no evidence that Mom knew Dad intended a fire, and I would not invent knowledge the evidence had not reached. But one fact now stood apart from the rest. Dad had disappeared. Dad had returned. The appraisal was 3 days away. And Mom was the person who had changed the lunch date, pushed everyone to attend, insisted on photographs, and kept us gathered outside. If that afternoon had been designed to look normal, only one person had made normality her job. My mother. By the 7th week after the fire, Miles had learned how to hate the word progress. Doctors used it when he tolerated a longer therapy session. Therapists used it when he moved an arm a few degrees farther than the week before. Nurses used it when he slept through a dressing change without waking in panic. To everyone else, progress meant the future. To Miles, it usually meant someone was about to ask him to do something that hurt. That morning, the goal was standing longer than he had the day before. I watched from the side because hovering made him angry, and leaving felt impossible. Scott stood farther back near the window, arms folded, forcing himself not to step in every time Miles's knees trembled. The therapist counted quietly. Miles stared at the floor. His jaw tightened. Sweat gathered near his hairline even though the room was cool. There had been a time when I measured my son's life in school years, birthdays, shoes he outgrew, and summers that disappeared too quickly. Now I measured it in seconds upright. 26, 27, 28. His fingers curled around the support bar. At 31 seconds, he sat. The therapist called it a good session. Miles looked at her as though she had personally betrayed him. But after she left, he leaned back against the pillows with an expression I recognized. Not pride exactly. Satisfaction. He did not want us to notice. Scott noticed anyway. He did not praise him. He had learned that praise could make Miles feel watched. He simply marked something on the little paper calendar taped beside the window and moved on. That calendar had become one of the few things in the room that felt hopeful without lying. No promises, just dates and tiny marks. One longer walk, one better night, one procedure behind us. One day, with less medication. Recovery had stopped being a staircase. It was more like crossing a yard full of holes while looking backward to see whether you had moved at all. That afternoon, Miles asked the question I had been waiting for since the first week. He did not ask it dramatically. There was no build-up. Scott had gone downstairs for coffee. The television was on without sound. I was folding one of Miles's clean shirts when he spoke. Did Grandpa know I was inside? My hands stopped on the shirt. For weeks, I had feared the question because I thought truth and protection might point in opposite directions. By then, I knew my job was to keep the answer true. I set the shirt down and pulled my chair closer. Miles watched my face the way children watch adults when they suspect the answer is being edited. I had taught him to do that. Not intentionally, but I had. I told him the timeline we knew. Grandpa had gone inside. Grandpa had returned to the patio. Miles had gone back upstairs for his headphones after that. The smoke had appeared later. Investigators had not told us they had evidence Grandpa knew Miles had gone back in. I chose every word carefully, not because I was afraid of implicating Dad, because I had promised Miles I would stop turning uncertainty into whatever answer felt safest. So you think he didn't know? I nodded slowly. That's what the timing looks like to me. Miles lowered his eyes. His shoulders loosened. The change was so small another person might have missed it. I did not. Relief moved through him before he could decide whether he was allowed to feel it. Then he asked the harder question. Then why didn't he tell the truth after? The question shifted the wound from what Grandpa knew before the smoke to what he chose after it. He had seen Miles carried out. He had seen the helicopter. He knew burns covered parts of his grandson's body. He knew there would be surgeries. And whatever Richard Bellamy knew about the fire, he had not walked toward us and said it. I did not explain Dad. I did not tell Miles about pride, fear, debt, the appraisal, the missing antiques, or any of the adult theories that had occupied my mind for weeks. None of them answered his question. I told him only that Grandpa would have to answer for the choices he made after the fire. Miles looked toward the muted television. His mouth tightened. That's worse. The sentence was barely above a whisper. I knew what he meant. A terrible mistake followed by immediate truth would have been one kind of tragedy. Miles was beginning to understand that what happened afterward had been a series of choices. Scott returned 10 minutes later, carrying coffee and a paper bag from the cafeteria. He knew immediately that something had happened. Miles's face had gone distant, in the way we both recognized now. I told him Miles had asked about Grandpa knowing he was inside. Scott set the coffees down. He did not add his own conclusion. He only confirmed the sequence I had given. Dad was outside before Miles went back in. There was no evidence we knew of that Dad had seen him return upstairs. Miles absorbed the same answer twice and seemed to need that. Then Scott changed the subject, deliberately. Not to distract him from truth. To stop truth from consuming the entire afternoon. He pulled a handheld game system from the paper bag. It belonged to a volunteer program at the hospital, and Scott had apparently spent 20 minutes convincing someone he understood how to use it. He did not. Miles learned that in under 3 minutes. Scott picked the wrong character, drove in the wrong direction, and managed to lose a racing game before completing one lap. Miles watched him with growing disbelief. Dad. Scott blamed the controls. Miles blamed age. Scott reminded him that 44 was not old. Miles told him that was probably what 44-year-olds said. I watched my husband lose 3 races in a row, while our son's mouth gradually changed from a straight line into something lighter. Then Miles laughed. A real laugh. It lasted long enough that Scott looked up. For 1 second, all 3 of us froze. We had become so careful around joy that sometimes we treated it like it might break. Miles noticed that too. His smile faded slightly. I refused to let guilt take the room back. I laughed at Scott instead. That solved it. Scott accused both of us of disloyalty and continued losing. For 20 minutes, nobody said fire. Nobody said insurance. Nobody said Richard. The world shrank to a bad racing game, and my husband's refusal to admit a 12-year-old was better at it. I stored the sound of Miles laughing somewhere separate from every photograph and timeline. Proof of a different kind. Proof that pain had not taken everything. 2 days later, Mom asked to see him. Her message was careful. No pressure. No accusation. She said she understood Scott and I had concerns, but she wanted to know whether Miles might be willing to let her visit for a few minutes. Weeks earlier, I would have decided, before asking him. I might have said no to protect him, or yes because I felt sorry for her. Both choices would have been mine. This time I carried the question into his room and left it where it belonged. With him, I told him Grandma had asked to visit. I made sure he knew he did not have to answer immediately, and that whatever he decided would not be used to judge him. Miles looked at the game system beside his bed. His fingers rested over the buttons without moving. Would Grandpa come? I said no. Grandma had asked for herself. He thought about it, then shook his head. Not angrily. Not yet. I told him that was enough. Mom did not take it well. She did not scream. Diane Bellamy had never needed volume to make disappointment fill a room. When I called, I could hear her breathing change. As soon as I said Miles was not ready, she reminded me that she had only seen him once since the fire. I told her I knew. She said she had barely slept in weeks. I believed her. She said every time her phone rang, she imagined something had gone wrong with his recovery. I believed that too. Then she asked whether I had told Miles not to see her. I did not rise to it. I told her I had asked him what he wanted. He had answered. That was the boundary. For several seconds, the call held only silence. Then Mom said she was his grandmother. There was no threat in the statement, only pain. I let the pain exist without changing the answer. That was new for me. I used to believe compassion required movement. Someone hurt, so I adjusted. Someone cried, so I gave more. Someone felt rejected, so I softened the line. But sometimes compassion was simply refusing to pretend another person's suffering did not exist while still saying no. I told Mom I believed being separated from Miles was hurting her. I also told her he had the right not to see anyone he was not ready to see. She ended the call shortly afterward. I sat with the phone in my lap for a while. I did not feel victorious. Boundaries were rarely satisfying when the person on the other side was someone you still loved. That was another lie people told about cutting off toxic behavior, as if saying no automatically filled you with strength. Mostly, it left empty space where a relationship used to be. Mom tried again 3 days later. Not with Miles, with me. She asked to meet near the hospital. Scott thought I should decline. Not because he wanted to control me. He simply did not see what Mom could give me except more pressure. I understood. But I also knew there were questions that would not become easier by avoiding her. We met in a small courtyard outside the hospital complex. Autumn had begun pressing into the air. The heat had finally broken, and dry leaves had gathered against one wall. Mom wore sunglasses even though the sun was weak. She removed them when she saw me. Her eyes looked swollen. We sat at opposite ends of a bench. For several minutes, she asked about Miles. I gave her the updates he had agreed I could share. He was standing longer. Therapy remained difficult. There would still be procedures ahead. He had laughed at Scott playing a game badly. Mom smiled at that. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from her since September 12th. He always did love watching people fail at things. The line was almost normal. I remembered Miles at 8, laughing while Dad tried to assemble a backyard soccer goal without instructions. I remembered Mom bringing lemonade outside. I remembered a family that had not always been dangerous. Good memories were becoming harder to hold because every new fact made them feel contaminated. I was learning not to do that. The afternoon Dad taught Miles about clocks had been real. So was the fire. My mother sitting through a school concert because Miles was afraid had been real. So was her pressure about the 11 minutes. Human beings did not become fictional versions of themselves just because they crossed a moral line. If anything, the good memories made the line matter more. Mom asked again whether Miles had said anything about her. I told her he was not ready. Her smile disappeared. She looked across the courtyard. Then she told him about Dad. I said I had told him only what we knew. Dad had been back outside before Miles went inside. We did not have evidence that Richard knew his grandson had returned upstairs. Mom closed her eyes. The relief in her face was immediate. It was not subtle. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and bowed her head. Thank God. The words came out rough. That reaction did something unexpected to me. It made her look less guilty, for 1 second. Not innocent. Human. A grandmother relieved her grandson did not believe his grandfather had knowingly left him to burn. Then her composure broke further. She said she had never wanted any of this. The sentence hung between us. I waited. My pulse began beating harder at the base of my throat. Mom stared at the leaves near her shoes. She said there were things I did not understand about what had been happening before the fire. I waited again. She looked older than 68. Her hands twisted together. Your father was under more pressure than you knew. I said nothing. This was the closest she had come to opening the door herself. No accusation, no investigator, no insurance representative. Just me, her daughter. For a moment, I believed she might tell me. Maybe about the debt, maybe the antiques, maybe why she had pushed the lunch, maybe something I had not imagined. Her lips parted. She looked directly at me. Then fear replaced whatever had been there. I watched the retreat happen. Her shoulders straightened. Her hands became still. Diane Bellamy returned. The woman who could organize a room before anyone noticed disorder. She said pressure made people do foolish things. She said Dad had made mistakes. She said none of that meant investigators were right about everything they suspected. The confession dissolved before it existed. I did not chase it. I had spent too long pulling explanations from people who only intended to give enough truth to control what came next. If Mom wanted to tell me something, she could tell it. I would not construct it for her. So we sat in silence. A gust of wind pushed leaves across the pavement. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, an ambulance backed into the hospital and made the familiar warning sound that had become part of the background of my life. Mom finally looked at me again. She asked whether I had given investigators the photographs from the patio. I said yes. She already knew that. Then she asked whether I had told them Richard had gone inside. I said yes. Her jaw tightened. One last opportunity remained. She could have asked how Miles was sleeping. She could have asked whether Scott and I needed anything. She could have gone back to the sentence she had abandoned about Dad being under pressure. Instead, she asked the question that told me what still mattered most to her. What exactly did you say about those 11 minutes? I looked at my mother, not at her tears, not at the trembling in her fingers, at the question. The same 11 minutes she had tried to erase weeks earlier. The same 11 minutes that placed Dad somewhere inside the house before he returned to the patio. I told her I had said only what I could remember and what the photographs supported. Nothing more, nothing less. Her face closed. That was the end of the meeting. She stood and put her sunglasses back on. I watched her walk toward the parking garage until she disappeared behind a concrete column. Then I stayed on the bench. Part of me wanted to believe her near confession mattered more than the retreat. Maybe it did. Maybe conscience was still alive in her. But conscience that never changed behavior could not protect Miles. It could not undo a false statement. It could not repair a burned house. It could not answer why Richard kept lying after the helicopter took off. And it could not explain why, when my mother came closer than ever to telling me the truth, she abandoned it for the same question she had been asking since the beginning. Not what happened to Miles. Not what Dad had done. Not what she could make right. She wanted to know whether my memory of those 11 minutes could still save Richard. After Mom asked exactly what I had told investigators about the 11 minutes, I stopped trying to decide whether her almost confession meant more than her retreat. It did not matter what she had almost done. What mattered was what she kept choosing. That distinction became clearer over the next several weeks, because the investigation finally began to move from questions about the house into questions about the people who had described what was supposed to be inside it. No single discovery changed the case. The picture sharpened through overlap: a confirmed sale, the loss list, the appraisal, the family timeline, and answers that stopped fitting together. By the beginning of the 3rd month after the fire, Miles had moved into a different stage of recovery. He was no longer in the first brutal stretch where every day felt like an emergency. Some of his care had shifted toward rehabilitation, additional procedures, and the long, repetitive work of teaching injured skin and frightened muscles to tolerate movement again. That did not mean the hard part was behind us. It meant the hard part had changed shape. He slept badly after certain therapy days. He flinched when alarms sounded unexpectedly. He had started asking for the bathroom door to remain slightly open at night, because closed rooms made him uneasy if he could not hear us nearby. Nobody called those things setbacks. They were simply part of the landscape now. Scott and I had learned not to announce every small victory like a press conference. Miles hated that. If he stood longer, we noticed. If he ate more, we noticed. If he slept 4 hours without waking, we noticed. We let most of those victories stay quiet. The investigation had to learn that kind of patience too. In a routine update, Leah told me investigators and the insurer had authenticated the dealer record. The federal writing desk had left my parents' collection months before the fire, yet Mom had personally confirmed it as a post-fire loss. An outdated schedule could be sloppy. A post-fire confirmation required an explanation. I looked through the glass wall toward the corridor. Miles was with Scott and one of the therapists 2 floors away. I thought about Mom standing beside his bed weeks earlier, calling the fire an accident. I thought about her standing on the lawn, talking about insurance before the helicopter lifted. I thought about her looking at me in the courtyard and saying Dad had been under pressure. Then I thought about the writing desk. Not furniture. A decision. Mom had confirmed something as destroyed after Miles was burned. That was harder to place inside the version of her I had spent my life carrying. Audrey supplied another fact from her own records. Before the fire, Mom had asked whether the September 15th review could be handled through existing documents and photographs rather than a full on-site inspection. Audrey had told her no. Diane therefore knew physical verification was coming, and knew it could not simply become a paperwork exercise. Eric reached his own threshold around the same time. He had been right to resist turning early clues into conclusions, but the innocent explanations now had to multiply around the authenticated sale, the false loss entry, the appraisal, and Mom's behavior. The idea that Diane, who noticed nearly everything, had somehow remained ignorant of major pieces leaving the collection, had stopped feeling credible to him. He still did not call her evil. Neither did I. Words like evil had become less useful the closer I got to what my parents had done. They were too simple. Eric rubbed both hands over his face. He said if Mom had known before the fire, then everything about the lunch changed. The date, the photographs, keeping us outside, her questions about 11 minutes. I watched him connect the same pieces I had. He did not look angry first. He looked ashamed. Not because he had defended her. Because some part of him had needed her to be innocent enough that the family still had one parent standing outside the worst of it. I understood that too well to judge him. The next time Mom asked to meet, I did not bring a list. I did not show her photographs. I did not mention Audrey's call or Leah's update. I had spent months watching adults hide inside details. So I decided to ask one question that could not be softened by another antique, another schedule, another memory. We met at a small park not far from the temporary rental where she and Dad were still living. The house itself remained tied up in repairs, investigation, and insurance disputes. My parents' life had narrowed into rented rooms, legal appointments, and people calling at hours they once reserved for dinner. Mom looked different, not ruined, not humbled in some dramatic way, just worn down. Her hair was still done, her coat still matched her shoes, but she had stopped wearing jewelry. I noticed because my mother had always worn at least one piece, even to the grocery store. We sat on a bench facing a pond. I told her Miles had managed another full therapy session that week. She asked whether he had said anything about her. I told her he still did not want to visit. She looked away. For a while, we watched two children throwing pieces of bread toward ducks despite a sign telling them not to. Then I asked the question, "Did you know there would be a fire?" Mom did not move. That was my answer before she gave one. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. The pond moved behind her reflection in my sunglasses. Seconds passed. I did not rescue her. I did not rephrase. I did not offer an easier question. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the practiced shape I knew. She said Dad had told her there was going to be an incident in the gallery wing, something contained, something that would damage the room enough that the missing pieces could no longer be physically verified the way the insurer expected. She said he promised her it would happen after everyone was outside. He promised it would not spread the way it did. He promised nobody would be hurt. My body went cold, even though I had suspected some version of it for weeks. Suspicion and confirmation were not the same. Suspicion left an escape route. Her words closed it. Mom admitted she knew some originals had been sold, knew the paper collection was worth more than what remained in the house, and knew the September 15th inspection would expose discrepancies they could no longer explain. Richard had framed the fire as the last ugly solution to a situation already beyond saving. Then came the sentence I had expected. We were going to lose everything. The ducks moved across the pond. A car door closed somewhere behind us. My mother stared straight ahead. I understood the life she meant. The house, solvency, Dad's reputation, her social world, the version of themselves they had spent decades preserving. Her fear was real. Real pain could still produce terrible decisions. Mom said Dad believed the fire would turn a financial collapse into an insurance loss they could survive. Everyone would be outside. The damage would be contained. The policy would pay. They could settle debts and reconstruct the collection story later. She repeated that he never meant for Miles to be in the house. I did not argue. The timeline supported that. She repeated that they had never intended anyone to be injured. I did not argue with that either. Intention was not the part I needed to dispute. I looked at her hands. They were trembling. Miles was hurt. 3 words. That was all. Mom closed her eyes. Tears moved down her face. She said she knew. She said she saw him every time she tried to sleep. She heard the helicopter in dreams. She still smelled smoke on clothing she had thrown away weeks ago. I believed every bit of it. Then she said they had had no choice. And that was where sympathy ended. Not because I could not understand her fear, because she was still trying to turn fear into necessity. I told her fear had not erased the alternatives. Disclosure, loss, humiliation, selling the house, admitting the debt. None was painless, but they were choices. Mom flinched. She said it was easy for me to say that from the outside. On that point, she was right. I had not been 71 years old watching a lifetime of success collapse. I had not been 68, and facing the possibility that my home, marriage, and social world were all tied to lies I had helped maintain. I had not lived inside their fear. Understanding that did not require me to call fire inevitable. Mom looked at me then. The grief in her face was almost unbearable. She said I had already punished her before I knew all of this. She had lost access to Miles. I had kept her away after one brief visit. She said I had treated her like a danger before I knew exactly what she had done. That criticism had truth in it. I sat with it. I had built a safety boundary, while facts were still incomplete. It had hurt her. I told her I knew that. I told her I understood being cut off from Miles had caused her real pain. I did not pretend otherwise. But the boundary had not been revenge. Miles was recovering from a fire that had happened in her home, and she had given him certainty about the cause before we knew the facts. Later, when he had been given the choice himself, he did not want contact. Her pain mattered. His boundary still stood. Mom's face tightened. She wanted acknowledgement to become concession. I could not give her that. We sat quietly. For a few minutes. I remembered her at Miles's school concert when he was 9. He had been terrified he would miss his cue. Mom had arrived 40 minutes early because she knew being late would make him worse. She sat in the second row and held up both thumbs when he looked toward the audience. Afterward, she bought him ice cream and listened to him describe every mistake nobody else had noticed. That memory was real. So was the woman beside me, who had known her husband planned to create a fire. One truth did not erase the other. I had finally stopped needing it to. Mom did not become incapable of love, because she had crossed a criminal and moral line. Her love simply had not been strong enough to stop her from crossing it. That was worse in some ways. Before we parted, I asked one more thing. Why insist we come? She looked toward the pond again. Her answer was quieter. Dad believed it would help if the day looked normal. A family lunch, everyone outside, pictures, and people who could honestly remember Richard sitting with them before smoke appeared. They had not needed us to lie. They needed normal memories around an abnormal act. Mom had helped arrange that. I stood. She did not ask me to forgive her. Not that day. She only asked whether I was going to tell investigators what she had just told me. I looked at her. There was no point pretending. Yes. Her shoulders dropped. Not because she had expected anything else, because hearing it made the consequence real. I left her on the bench. The drive back to Richmond took less than half an hour. I remember almost none of it. My hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, as if I were taking a driving test. At a red light, I noticed a faint scar on the inside of my wrist from the day of the fire. I had not known I had scraped myself until days later. It was almost gone. Miles's scars would not disappear that easily. That fact cut through every attempt I had to feel sorry for my parents. Not because pity was wrong, because pity could not be allowed to become distortion. I gave Leah the substance of Mom's admission without adding interpretation. Diane knew there would be a fire event, knew the collection discrepancies and appraisal deadline, helped arrange the family gathering and photographs, believed Richard's assurance that everyone would be outside, and later participated in the loss inventory. Leah took it from there. Eric learned about Mom's admission from me later that week. He did not say much. He sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wood grain. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. So she knew. I nodded. He did not ask for details. Not yet. Sometimes grief needed a simpler sentence before it could tolerate the whole truth. Scott's reaction was different. He listened, then asked whether I was all right. I almost laughed at the uselessness of the question. Instead, I told him I did not know what all right meant anymore. He accepted that. We went upstairs to check on Miles. Our son was sleeping on his side, with one hand tucked beneath the pillow. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary. Scott did not hurry me. In that room, every adult theory became smaller. What remained was consequence. That night, after Miles had fallen asleep and Scott was in the shower, my phone rang. Dad. I watched his name until the screen almost went dark. Then I answered. His voice sounded older than it had in his voicemail after the fire. There was no small talk. He said Mom had told him we had met. He knew what she had admitted. He said investigators were asking questions that were going to destroy her. I did not respond. Dad said he would take responsibility for the fire, the collection, the insurance claim, and what happened to Miles, but only if I preserved one distinction for him. He wanted me to say Diane had known about the financial trouble, but had not understood his plan until after the fire began. It was a confession with one corner folded under. Enough truth to resemble accountability. Enough lie to save her. Dad kept talking, telling me Mom would not survive prison, that she had followed his lead, that he had created the problem and should carry it. His voice cracked once. I believed he loved her. I believed he was frightened for her. I even believed he wanted, in his own way, to take responsibility. But responsibility that required someone else to alter the truth was only another version of the same thing he had been doing for years. Fixing the story instead of facing what happened. I looked toward the dark hallway leading to Miles's room. Dad had finally reached the point where he was willing to tell me the truth. Just not the whole truth. And once again, the part he wanted removed was the part he needed his daughter to fix for him. Dad called again 2 days after his first request to protect Mom. This time, he did not try to explain himself over the phone. He asked to see me. By then, almost 4 months had passed since the fire. Long enough for autumn to turn into winter, for the burns on Miles's body to begin becoming scars instead of open wounds, and for my parents' entire life to shrink into a rented townhouse filled with cardboard boxes. I agreed to meet Dad there on a Saturday afternoon. Mom would not be present. Scott drove me, because neither of us liked the idea of my car sitting outside their rental if reporters or curious neighbors had begun paying attention, but he did not come inside. He parked 2 blocks away with coffee and told me to text when I was ready. Scott did not tell me what to say or how to feel. Some choices needed witnesses. This one did not. Dad opened the door before I knocked twice. For one disorienting second, I thought I had the wrong house. Richard Bellamy had spent most of my life surrounded by things that seemed to confirm who he believed himself to be. Heavy furniture, framed architectural drawings, old leather chairs, silver trays no one actually needed. Objects with provenance. The rented townhouse had beige walls and a sofa that looked as if it had come with the lease. There was nothing on the entry table. No clock, no antique chest, no carefully chosen lamp. The emptiness made him look smaller. He wore an old navy sweater I remembered from childhood Christmas mornings. His hair had grown longer around the sides because he had apparently stopped caring about the appointment schedule he once guarded like law. He looked 71, not the version of 71 he had curated, just 71. For a moment, I saw my father instead of the man at the center of an investigation. Love had not disappeared just because the facts had become unbearable. Dad led me into the kitchen. A chipped ceramic mug sat near the sink. He gestured toward the small table but did not offer me anything. We both understood this was not a visit. He sat across from me. His hands looked unfamiliar without the gold watch he had worn for years. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. I did not rescue him. That was another habit I had been breaking. Eventually, he told me the first thing he wanted me to know. I didn't know Miles went back inside. His voice cracked on my son's name. I believed him because the timeline supported it. Dad had returned to the patio before Miles remembered his headphones. Mom had taken the photographs. Miles asked me if he could go back upstairs afterward. No one had reacted because no one around him had behaved as though entering the house was dangerous. I nodded. I believe you. Dad's head lifted. Relief crossed his face so quickly it made me ache. It was the piece of truth he needed most desperately to keep. He had not intentionally burned his grandson. That did not make him innocent. Dad began telling me how everything had started. He did not give me a grand confession. There was no sudden flood of remorse containing every date, every transaction, and every lie. What he gave me was messier and more believable. One sale, then another. The first antique had gone in 2023. After an investment he expected to recover, continued losing money. He told himself the sale was temporary. He would replace the piece before anyone needed to know. He did not. Another investment required cash. A loan came due. The house cost more to maintain than he admitted. Mom's charity commitments, club dues, property expenses, and the ordinary machinery of an expensive life continued while the liquid money underneath them thinned. So he sold another piece. Then another. Sometimes through dealers, sometimes privately. The collection became a reserve account he could quietly empty without telling the people around him that Richard Bellamy, the man who had spent decades advising other people how to manage assets, had become frightened of his own bank statements. He expected to repair the damage. That part was repeated several times, when markets improved, when one real estate position paid out, when a partnership resolved, when he refinanced, when he sold something else. Every solution had been waiting just beyond the next month. None arrived. I listened without interrupting. He had understood risk. The failure was believing his own rules would bend for him, until one more private correction fixed the last one. By 2025, the collection in the house no longer matched the collection in the records. Dad admitted he had sometimes replaced missing originals with less valuable pieces that looked similar enough from a room away. In other cases, he rearranged spaces and relied on the fact that most visitors did not know what had once stood where. Mom knew pieces were leaving. Not every deal. Enough. She knew the insurance schedules were no longer accurate. She knew their finances were worse than they presented. And by the time the insurer demanded updated physical verification, both of them understood that the gap could no longer be hidden by moving furniture. The physical appraisal frightened him, because a professional could not be talked out of noticing what was missing. After 2 postponements, September 15th had become the wall. He intended the gallery fire to make physical verification impossible, believed the damage would stay contained, expected everyone to remain outside, and planned to be back on the patio before anything looked wrong. He also believed the family's honest memory of him outside would help the day look ordinary. When he stopped, he knew I understood. We had not been invited to lie. We had been invited to make the afternoon look normal, to be the daughter, husband, and grandson who could honestly remember Dad sitting outside when smoke appeared. Mom had helped build that scene around the act. Dad stared down at his hands. He said he had thought through everything except the one thing that mattered. Miles going back inside. I pictured Miles remembering his headphones, me telling him to be quick, and Dad sitting outside with no alarm in his face. He had not known Miles went back in. He thought his plan was still under control until smoke appeared and control became consequence. I could see how a human being might make the first catastrophic choice and panic when the result became larger than intended. What I still could not understand was everything after. So I asked him, "Why didn't you tell the truth after you saw Miles?" Dad went still. The rented kitchen seemed to grow quieter around us. That was the question no discussion of intent could answer. I watched him search for language. There was none that made what happened respectable. He finally said that when the helicopter lifted, he knew that if he admitted what he had done, everything would be gone. Everything. The word sat between us. For months I had been hearing versions of it. Mom had used it too. We were going to lose everything. Dad's everything meant the house, reputation, collection, financial security, and identity he had spent half a century building. Those losses were real and frightening. But while he was calculating them, Miles was being flown to a burn center. I did not need to tell Dad that. His eyes dropped before I could. He knew. That was part of the punishment already happening inside him. It still had not been enough to make him stop. Instead, he went forward with the loss claim, left already sold items on it, and let the fire be described as an accident. Each lie made confession feel harder, but the trap had been built by his own decisions. Dad rubbed one hand across his face. He looked exhausted. For a moment, I felt something dangerously close to pity. Not forgiveness. Pity. This man had held my bicycle seat when I was 6. He had sat in the front row when I graduated college and cried where he thought no one could see him. He had driven 3 hours in the middle of the night when Scott and I once broke down on our way home from the beach. He had loved Miles. I believed all of those things. I also believed what he had just admitted. That was the part people often wanted morality to make easier. They wanted love and guilt to cancel each other. They did not. I still loved my father. That did not require me to alter what he had done. Dad finally reached the reason he had asked me there. Mom. He said Diane had followed him into a situation he created. She had known some things, yes. She had known about missing antiques and the appraisal. She had known he intended something to happen in the gallery. But he wanted me to tell investigators that she had not understood the full plan until after the fire began. The version was almost identical to what he had asked for on the phone. Only now I knew exactly how false it was. Mom had already told me she knew there would be a fire event, knew why everyone was supposed to be outside, and had helped organize the lunch and photographs. She had also tried to make the 11 minutes disappear afterward. She could be frightened and still have chosen. Dad leaned forward. His hands tightened together. He said prison would destroy her. I looked around the rented kitchen. Their old house was damaged and tied up in claims and investigation. Their friends had begun disappearing. Dad's reputation was already bleeding into collector circles. Mom had lost contact with Miles. I did not doubt that prison would break something else. I also knew what Miles had been asked to endure without choosing any of it. I did not compare the suffering aloud. That would have turned the conversation into a contest. Dad did enough of that inside his own reasoning. He said he had been the one who started the chain. He should carry the worst consequence. There was love in that request. Real love. The problem was that love had become another reason to edit the truth. I had seen this pattern my entire life. Protect the person you loved by smoothing the sharp part. Move the chair. Turn the stained tablecloth. Change the story just enough that the room still looked presentable when the next person walked in. For years, I had believed my role in that system was almost involuntary. The reliable daughter. The fixer. But sitting across from Dad, I understood something I needed to admit to myself. I had choices. I had always had choices. Maybe they had been trained into difficult shapes. Maybe disappointing my parents carried a cost other people did not understand. That still did not make me powerless. I could leave that rental and tell investigators Diane had known less than she admitted. I could describe Mom's actions more gently. I could emphasize uncertainty until it swallowed what I knew. Nobody was physically stopping me from doing that. I had a choice. That was exactly why the next part mattered. I can tell them what I know, I said. I won't tell them something I don't. Dad's face changed. Not shock, defeat. I continued before I lost the nerve. I would also tell them the things that helped him. The timeline showed he was already outside before Miles went back into the house. I had no evidence that he knew Miles was upstairs. If anyone asked me, I would say that exactly. But I would also say what Mom had told me. She knew there would be a fire. She knew why. She helped create the family afternoon around it. I would not make one fact larger because it hurt him, or another smaller because it hurt her. Dad stared at the tabletop. Nothing dramatic happened in the room. He asked for a lie, and I refused it. Dad did not argue after that. Perhaps he finally understood there was nowhere left to move the furniture. I stood. Before I reached the door, he said my name. I turned. He looked at me with the expression I remembered from when I was a child, and had disappointed him in some small way. The old reflex still existed. Explain. Fix. Make him feel less abandoned. I let it pass, then I left. Scott was waiting 2 blocks away. I told him Dad had admitted the fire plan, confirmed he had not known. Miles went back in and asked me to soften Mom's role. Scott kept his eyes on the road and found my hand across the console. The case did not turn on my decision. I was relieved by that. For weeks, part of me had feared that telling the truth would somehow make me personally responsible for whatever happened to my parents next. It did not. Investigators already had an independent structure. Fire, origin work, the Zippo, the 11-minute gap, appraisal records, dealer records, the false loss inventory, financial evidence, and my parents' own statements. My testimony was one piece, Eric's another. Several days after my meeting with Dad, Eric sat with investigators and gave them what he actually remembered about the crate. He provided the old message Dad had sent, calling it a restoration pickup and the approximate date. He did not claim to know what had been inside. He did not embellish. That restraint cost him something. I could see it afterward. He told me he had spent most of his life thinking loyalty meant giving family the best interpretation. Now he was learning that sometimes loyalty to truth meant refusing to add anything at all. Weeks passed through interviews, document review, attorneys, and separate insurance and criminal work. Miles went to therapy. Scott and I returned to work in blocks. Life did not stop waiting for charges. Then one cold morning, I received a victim notification that formal charges had been filed. My parents appeared through counsel, and formal charges reflected the intentional fire-related conduct, insurance fraud scheme, and concealment investigators had spent months building. Evidence, not my anger, had reached the threshold for consequences. The social consequences arrived more quietly. Dad's name had once carried weight among dealers and collectors because people trusted his description of where pieces came from and how long they had been held. That trust evaporated faster than money. Audrey never gossiped to me about the collector world, but I heard enough through people who contacted the family after the charges became public record. Dealers began checking old transactions more carefully. People who had once invited Dad to private previews stopped calling. A museum committee Mom had supported for years quietly removed her from an upcoming event. No public shaming, no crowd pointing, just doors that used to open no longer opening. I thought Dad would have hated that most. Then I stopped trying to rank his losses for him. One evening, not long after the charges were filed, I sat beside Miles on our sofa. He had been home long enough for us to develop new routines around his care. The living room contained therapy equipment, where a decorative chair used to stand. A small humidifier sat on a side table. The coffee table had been pushed farther away to give him more room. Our house no longer looked the way it had before September. I did not mind. Miles was tired that night, but not exhausted. I had promised him we would not hide major facts about the fire when they directly concerned him. This one did. I told him Grandpa had admitted causing the fire in the gallery. I kept the adult financial details simple. He had been hiding things about the collection and made a terrible decision because he did not want those things discovered. Miles listened without moving. Then I told him the part I knew he needed most. Grandpa said he did not know Miles had gone back inside. The timeline we already knew supported that. I did not tell Miles what emotion he should have or ask him to forgive anyone. He looked down at the scars along one hand. For a long time, he traced the edge of one with his thumb. Then he asked whether Grandpa had told the truth right after the fire. I said no. Miles nodded once. He already knew that answer. Knowing Dad had finally admitted it months later did not repair the months before. I watched my son absorb the difference between intention and responsibility in a way no 12-year-old should have needed to learn so early. Grandpa had not wanted him burned. Grandpa had still created the fire. Grandpa had panicked when Miles was trapped. Grandpa had still chosen to protect himself afterward. All of those things were true at once. Miles leaned back against the sofa. His face looked younger when he was tired. For 1 second, I saw the boy standing beside an antique clock, teasing Grandpa about making a screw more complicated than a war. That memory belonged to him too. I could not burn it away simply because another truth had arrived. Miles looked toward me. His voice was small. What if I still miss him? That was the question waiting beyond every investigation, every charge, and every truth I had fought to keep intact. The law could decide what my father had done. It could not decide for Miles what loving him was supposed to mean now. When Miles asked what it meant if he still missed his grandfather, I told him he was allowed to miss whoever he missed. Missing Grandpa did not decide forgiveness or contact. What he did with that feeling could wait. 14 months after the fire, that was still one of the most useful things any of us had learned. Time had moved forward, although for a long while it did not feel that way. Miles's recovery refused to follow a clean before and after structure. The most dangerous surgeries were behind him, but medical appointments still occupied squares on our calendar. Scar management had become part of daily life. Therapy continued. Certain movements remained tighter than they had been before the fire, and some mornings his body reminded him of September 12th before his mind had fully awakened. He had also grown almost 3 inches. That seemed unfair considering how many clothes we had already replaced because some fabrics irritated healing skin. He went back to school gradually. At first, only partial days, then longer stretches as he rebuilt stamina and confidence. He hated adults asking whether he was all better, because the question required him either to lie or explain more than he wanted. Eventually, he developed his own answer. He said he was getting there. No details. Most people learned to leave it alone. The scars remained visible in places. So did the less visible things. He checked smoke alarms himself whenever we stayed somewhere unfamiliar. For months, he preferred doors cracked open at night. The smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace once sent him silently back into the house, with both hands pressed against his stomach. Scott followed him inside without announcing why. 10 minutes later, they came back out together. We did not call the moment a setback. That language had begun to feel too much like judging a road none of us had chosen. Other things improved in ways no medical report could measure. Miles started complaining about homework again. He spent 45 minutes arguing with Scott about whether a new video game was worth $60. He began leaving socks in places no sock had any legitimate reason to be. One Saturday morning, I found 3 cereal bowls in his room. I stood in the doorway looking at them and nearly cried from gratitude before remembering that I was supposed to be annoyed. I made him carry them downstairs. Healing did not always look noble. Sometimes it looked like becoming irritating again. The criminal case took most of the year to resolve through hearings, records, negotiation, and victim updates. Richard eventually entered a negotiated plea, reflecting the intentional fire-related conduct used to conceal the missing collection and the fraudulent insurance scheme that followed. The record still reflected the fact that mattered to Miles. There was no evidence Richard had intended to injure his grandson. At sentencing, Richard received an active prison term, measured well into double digits. He was 72 by then. No one had to explain what that meant. Even without counting years, the arithmetic was heavy. Diane's case resolved separately. Her role had been different, and the outcome reflected that. She had not physically initiated the fire, but evidence showed she knew what Richard intended, helped create the circumstances around the family gathering, participated in the false loss narrative afterward, and tried to influence my account of the timeline. She received several years of active incarceration, followed by suspended time and supervision, along with restitution obligations tied to the scheme. Mom's fear mattered to the context of her role. It did not erase what she had done. I did not attend either sentencing in person. Some relatives were surprised, but I did not need to watch the sentences happen for them to be real. Miles had an appointment that morning, and I chose him without conflict. The prosecutor's office called afterward. I sat in my car outside the rehabilitation clinic while a woman gave me the outcome in calm, procedural language. When the call ended, I did not cheer. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I thought of Dad at 71 in the rented kitchen, asking me to save Mom. I thought of Mom in the park, telling me they had been going to lose everything. Then I thought of Miles upstairs in the Bellamy house, smoke cutting off the staircase, because two adults had decided losing everything financially was worse than admitting the truth. The law had finally placed a cost on that choice. It did not make the cost disappear from anyone else. The insurance claim was denied. By then, enough of the claim history and collection records had been examined that there was no plausible path to payment for the loss narrative my parents had originally presented. The house did not become some prize that fell into my hands. Neither did the collection. That would have been too neat. Existing debt, legal expenses, restitution obligations, and the financial consequences of the investigation consumed most of what remained. Property interests were liquidated through ordinary legal and financial processes. Pieces that still had legitimate value were handled according to ownership, liens, and restitution requirements. I received nothing. Eric received nothing. Miles received nothing. I was glad. The last thing our family needed was for justice to end with us counting what we inherited from the disaster. Dad had spent years treating objects as if they were proof that a family had succeeded. In the end, most of those objects became numbers on paperwork. The social consequences were quieter than the legal ones, and, in some ways, more complete. Richard's name had once mattered in collector circles. People trusted his stories about where objects had come from. They trusted his eye. They invited him into private sales and asked his opinion before making expensive decisions. That trust could not be sentenced. It simply disappeared. People checked old transactions with fresh suspicion. Dealers who had once taken his calls stopped returning them. His name no longer opened doors. It made people look twice at records. Mom lost her version of the same world. The museum committees and charity circles where she had spent years building relationships did not stage some public rejection. No one threw wine on her or made a speech. Her name quietly vanished from planning emails. An honorary committee listed online. 1 month no longer listed her the next. Invitations stopped. People who once called her first called someone else. The life she had tried so desperately to preserve survived long enough to prove it had never been as permanent as she believed. Eric struggled with all of it differently from me. He had spent enough months examining his own behavior that by the time sentencing came, he no longer needed to defend why he had been skeptical early on. He should have been skeptical. A Zippo near a suspected origin did not prove attempted murder. A missing antique did not prove arson. Dad being inside the house for 11 minutes did not, by itself, prove what he had done there. Eric had been right to insist on those distinctions. The part he eventually apologized for was different. We were sitting in my kitchen one evening after sentencing, when he said he had used reasonable doubt as cover after the doubt stopped being reasonable. Once the dealer records, false loss list, and timeline problems began accumulating, he had continued pressing me to stay quiet, because admitting what the evidence suggested frightened him. He had not wanted to lose Dad. Then he had not wanted to lose Mom too. The fear had been understandable. The pressure he put on me was still his responsibility. I did not tell him he had nothing to apologize for. That would have undone the point. I told him I understood. There was a difference. He nodded and looked toward the stairs, where Miles was loudly objecting to something Scott had said about a football game. Eric smiled. He had become careful around Miles without becoming unnatural. That mattered. Our son did not need a household full of adults treating him like glass. Scott and I had our own unfinished conversation. For months after the fire, I had told myself we had simply reacted differently because we were both terrified. That was true. It was also too convenient. Fear did not make every choice equal. Scott had been right early on about safety. He had wanted to restrict my parents' access to Miles until we understood what had happened. I had interpreted part of that as judgment, because I could not yet tolerate what judgment might cost me. Months later, after the case ended, I told him that plainly. We were folding laundry in our bedroom. Nothing about the setting felt important enough for an apology. Those were often the moments when the real ones happened. I admitted I had treated his caution as if it were an accusation against my family, when some of it had simply been good parenting. Scott did not use the moment to collect a victory. He admitted that in those first days he had also wanted me to arrive at his emotional conclusion as quickly as he had. He had needed Richard to become simple because simple anger was easier to survive than uncertainty. But he did not apologize for wanting Miles protected. I did not ask him to. We had stopped treating marriage like a court where every conflict required equal fault. Sometimes one person was more right about one thing. The relationship survived because being right did not have to become a weapon. My hardest apology remained, the one I owed Miles. I had already acknowledged it in the hospital, but acknowledgement during crisis and accountability after the crisis are not the same thing. One Sunday afternoon, we were sorting school papers at the dining table when I found an old worksheet from the weeks before the fire. Miles had written half an answer about American history and then drawn a tiny clock beside it. The clock reminded me of Dad. That reminded me of the first afternoon. Grandma calling the fire an accident. Me standing there and letting her. I asked Miles if he remembered that. He did. Children remembered more than adults hoped. I told him I still thought about the fact that I had wanted him comforted badly enough to let certainty replace honesty. I did not explain my reasons again. He already knew them. I apologized for the consequence, for making him believe the adults knew more than they did. Miles pushed the worksheet around with one finger. Then he said something that had apparently stayed with him longer than I understood. He had thought everyone knew the truth and was not telling him. That was what my silence had created. Not only reassurance, suspicion. I felt the old instinct rise immediately. Explain. Tell him I would never intentionally keep something that important from him. Remind him how afraid I had been. Instead, I listened. When he finished, I told him he had deserved better from me. No defense after it. That was enough. By then, the question of contact with my parents had become practical. Dad's attorney had passed along a request before he entered custody. He wanted to write to Miles. Mom wanted the same. Months earlier, I might have decided for my son. I did not anymore. I told Miles what they had asked. I made it clear that saying no did not make him cruel, and saying yes did not mean he had forgiven anything. He chose no, not forever. Not as a dramatic declaration. Just no for now. I respected it. There were times when updates about his health could be passed through approved legal channels, but I asked Miles before sharing anything beyond what was necessary. Sometimes he agreed to a short update. Sometimes he did not. My compassion for my parents stopped being something I practiced at my son's expense. That distinction brought more peace than cutting them off completely ever could have. Miles still missed Grandpa. Not every day. Sometimes a memory simply appeared. An old phrase. A story about a clock. A golf joke. One afternoon we were eating lunch when Scott confidently gave Miles an incorrect date for something historical. Miles immediately corrected him. Scott objected. Our son leaned back in his chair and said, "Grandpa would have needed 20 minutes just to explain why you're wrong." Silence hit the table for half a second. Then Miles smiled. I smiled back. Scott groaned. And we laughed. No one apologized for it. That was another kind of freedom. Remembering something good about Richard did not reopen a prison door. It did not erase Miles's scars. It did not change a sentence. The memory belonged to us now, not to him. We could keep it without giving him back the authority he once held. That idea would have confused me before the fire. Our family no longer fit clean emotional categories. Richard and Diane had loved Miles and had also made choices that harmed him. I could still love my parents and refuse to protect them from the truth. By the following November, our house had developed a different rhythm. There were still medical supplies in places they had not belonged 2 years earlier. There were still nights when Miles woke suddenly. There were also school projects on the dining table, dirty sneakers beside the door, and a new smoke detector system Scott had researched so obsessively that even Miles eventually told him he was making the house emotionally overqualified for fire. Scott took that as praise. I kept no valuable antique from my parents' collection. Anything financially valuable belonged inside the legal process. Anything emotionally valuable could live in memory without sitting on a shelf. I did keep the family photograph from the patio. Not the original physical print. A digital copy. For months, I could barely look at it. Dad's hand on Miles's shoulder. Mom behind the camera. Scott beside me. The image had once seemed like evidence of manipulation. Later, it became something more complicated. 4 people in that photograph did not know what was happening. One man believed he had controlled what would happen next. One woman knew enough to help make the afternoon look ordinary. And a 12-year-old leaned into a grandfather he trusted. The picture did not tell the whole truth. No photograph ever did. I stopped asking it to. One evening, close to 14 months after the fire, Miles and I sat on the back steps while Scott burned dinner inside. He was not actually burning it. The smell was garlic. I had learned to distinguish smoke from fear again, though my body sometimes took a second longer than my mind. Miles noticed me glance toward the kitchen. He noticed more things now. He did not comment. We sat beneath a cold November sky while leaves moved across the yard. His sleeves covered most of the scars on his arms. That had become his choice in cooler weather, not mine. For a while, we listened to Scott opening and closing cabinets. Then Miles asked whether people would always tell our family story, starting with the fire. I looked at him. The question caught me off guard. He was not crying. He did not sound afraid. He seemed irritated by the idea, as if September 12th had become an obnoxious relative who kept arriving first to every gathering. I thought about all the beginnings available to him. The day he was born. The first time Scott held him and looked terrified he might drop him. The afternoon he learned to ride a bicycle. The school concert Mom attended. The long case clock. The dinosaur puzzle. The first time he stood for 31 seconds in therapy and pretended not to be proud. The day he went back to school. The afternoon he laughed at the same grandpa memory he had once thought he might never be allowed to love again. The fire was part of his story. It did not own the beginning. I told him that. Miles looked across the yard. Then he nodded, as though I had finally said something obvious. Inside, Scott dropped something metal and muttered. Miles smirked. We went in to save dinner. For most of my life, I had thought legacy meant preserving a house, a name, a reputation, objects valuable enough to ensure. Dad had believed that so fiercely he endangered the people who would have carried his name forward. What survived instead was Miles learning that love did not require access, Scott and me learning to protect without controlling, Eric learning the boundary between skepticism and denial, and me learning that understanding a choice did not erase responsibility for it. A few weeks later, I found Miles at the dining table, working on another history assignment. There was no antique clock drawn beside this one, just his handwriting, a half-finished glass of milk, and one sock somehow lying under the chair. I almost told him to pick it up. Then I looked at the page. At my son. At the ordinary room around him. Nothing in that moment needed saving. It was already here. And for the first time since the helicopter lifted from my parents' lawn, that felt like enough.